This is Easy Drift Sleep, and tonight we have something special for you. We are going to guide you through the story of Ruth, uncovering its hidden corners and forgotten details. If these evenings bring you comfort, tap subscribe now. Your next story is always just one sleep away. Take a slow breath, release what you are holding, and let your story begin. The earth did not turn to dust all at once. It happened in slow, agonizing whispers across the limestone terraces of Bethlehem. There was a season when the winter rain simply failed to arrive, when the grey clouds gathered above the Judean hills only to be shredded by dry eastern winds, passing over the valleys without leaving a single drop upon the parched ground. In those days, the air carried a constant, fine grit that settled on the skin, in the corners of doorways, and deep within the throats of men and beasts alike. Elimelech stood at the edge of his ancestral field, his calloused hand shielding his eyes from the blinding glare of a midday sun that seemed to hang motionless in a pale, bleached sky. He looked out over the barley stalks, which should have stood high and heavy-headed, bowing gracefully in the breeze. Instead, they were stunted, brittle things of pale straw, their kernels shriveled and empty before the harvest had even truly begun. The soil beneath his sandals cracked in jagged patterns, as if the very ground was opening its mouth in a silent cry for moisture that would not come. He was a man whose shoulders bore the quiet weight of generations, an Israelite of the clan of Ephrathah, whose lineage was tied deeply to these rolling hills. Yet lately, the weight had shifted from a dull ache to a sharp, constant dread. He thought of his wife, Naomi, who was inside their stone dwelling, carefully measuring the dwindling grain from the clay storage jars, rationing out handfuls with a quiet, steady discipline that masked her own growing fear. Naomi was a woman of sharp intelligence and deep-rooted faith, her eyes observant and kind, yet these days those eyes held a shadow, the shadow of a mother watching the margins of survival shrink week by week. Elimelech turned back toward the house, his sandals crunching against the lifeless earth. He found Naomi sitting by the low wooden table, the afternoon light cutting through the small window and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the dim room. She was grinding a small measure of parched grain, the heavy stone rolling rhythmically against the lower slab. "The well at the lower terrace is down to the red mud," Elimelech said quietly, his voice dry and tired as he dropped his wooden staff against the doorpost. Naomi did not stop her work, though her hand slowed for a brief moment. The steady scrape of the stone was the only sound in a house that felt increasingly hollow. "The sheep will not survive another fortnight on the dry scrub," she replied, her tone level, devoid of self-pity, yet heavy with the realization of what that meant. "Malin and Kai Lion are strong boys, but they are growing. They need more than thin porridge and water." The two young men, their sons, entered just then, ducking their heads beneath the low lintel. Malin, the elder, carried a rusted iron mattock over his shoulder, while Kai Lion wiped sweat and dust from his forehead with the back of a sun-browned arm. They looked around their home not with the carefree spirit of youth, but with the heavy watchfulness of men who understood that the land was dying beneath their feet. "We heard talk in the square this morning," Malin said, his voice dropping as he sat on a low wooden stool. "From the traders coming up from the lowlands. They say the plains across the salt sea, down in the green plateaus of Moab, are untouched by the blight. The Arnon River runs full, and the wheat stands tall enough to hide a man." "Moab," The very name sat strangely on the tongue of an Israelite. Beyond the rugged, jagged mountains that fell away toward the Dead Sea lay a foreign land, a nation with its own gods, its own customs, and a long, tangled history with the tribes of Jacob. To leave Bethlehem was not merely to change address, it was to step outside the covenant boundary, to sever oneself from the ancestral soil where the bones of forebears lay buried, and to cast one's lot among strangers. Elimelech walked to the window, staring out toward the eastern horizon where the hills blurred into a hazy, shimmering heat. Fear is a quiet architect. It does not always arrive with panic, sometimes it wears the sensible face of survival, whispering that duty to one's family supersedes loyalty to a patch of dirt that refuses to yield its bread. Elimelech looked at his wife, searching her face for a sign, an anchor. "We cannot stay here and starve, Naomi," Elimelech murmured, the confession tearing softly from his chest. "Bread is the staff of life. If God has shut the heavens over Bethlehem, perhaps his mercy lingers elsewhere." Naomi rose from the grinding stone, dusting the flour from her hands. She walked over to her husband, her footsteps quiet and deliberate. She looked out the window with him, her gaze resting on the desolate fields where her people had farmed for centuries. The thought of leaving turned her stomach with a cold, sickening dread, yet the alternative, watching her husband and her sons waste away until there was no strength left to bury them, was a horror far worse. "To go to Moab is to walk into the unknown," Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper, rich with a melancholy that seemed to permeate the very stones of the room. "We will be strangers there, Elimelech. We will be the ones who speak with an accent, the ones who do not bow at their high places, the ones who watch from the outside. We will return," Elimelech promised, though even as he said the words, he knew he could not guarantee tomorrow, let alone a homecoming. "As soon as the rains return to Judea, as soon as the famine breaks, we will pack our tents and come back to our inheritance. We go only to dwell there as sojourners for a season." It was a decision born of quiet desperation, the kind of choice that alters the course of generations without any dramatic fanfare. They did not know, as they began to gather their meager belongings that evening, that they were stepping onto a path of profound sorrow, a path that would strip Elimelech and his sons of their lives and leave Naomi standing utterly alone, stripped of everything she held dear, before a strange and redemptive grace could finally lead her back home. The preparations were swift and sorrowful. They could not carry much, only the absolute essentials for a long, arduous journey across the rugged terrain. Iron tools, a few heavy cooking pots, woolen blankets, leather water skins, and the small wooden chest containing the family's few valuables and household records. The morning of their departure broke with the same cruel, cloudless glare. There was no grand farewell in the town square, for many of their neighbors were too consumed by their own quiet miseries to notice or care that another family was slipping away. Elimelech, Naomi, Mahlon, and Chilion shouldered their packs and walked down the dusty limestone path that wound its way out of Bethlehem, heading eastward toward the descent into the deep rift valley of the Jordan. As they reached the crest of the final hill before the land dropped away into the haze, Naomi paused. She turned back to look one last time at the town of her life. The white stone houses clung to the terraced slopes, surrounded by the grey-green ghosts of olive trees that drooped in the heat. A profound wave of grief washed over her, a premonition of loss so sharp that she had to close her eyes for a long moment to steady her breathing. "Come, Naomi," Elimelech said gently, placing a warm, heavy hand upon her shoulder. His own eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his jaw set with the grim determination of a provider trying to outrun catastrophe. She opened her eyes, nodded, and turned her back on Bethlehem. The descent was steep and punishing. They scrambled down the dry, rocky switchbacks of the Judean wilderness, where the landscape turned from sparse scrub into a desolate, chalky wasteland of jagged canyons and wind-sculpted cliffs. The air grew thicker and hotter the lower they dropped, baking the moisture from their bodies and filling their mouths with the taste of dust. By late afternoon, they crossed the sluggish, salt-encrusted Jordan River at a shallow ford, the water lukewarm around their ankles. From there, the ascent began anew, climbing upward out of the great Rift Valley and onto the high, rolling plateau of Moab. The contrast was startling. As they crested the eastern ridge, the barren desolation of the wilderness gave way to a landscape that felt almost mocking in its abundance. Here, the rolling hills were covered in thick, waist-high grasses that rippled like golden water under the late afternoon sun. Broad terraced fields of barley and wheat stretched across the plateaus, untouched by the blight that had strangled Judea. Flocks of fat-tailed sheep dotted the distant meadows, and the sweet, heavy scent of wild clover and damp earth hung thick in the cooling breeze. Yet for all its green fertility, Moab felt foreign. The architecture of the villages they passed was different, sturdier, rounder stone dwellings adorned with symbols of foreign deities carved into the lintels. The people they encountered along the winding dirt tracks wore unfamiliar garments of bright dyed wool, and their speech was a dialect of the Western Semitic tongue that rolled off the tongue with strange, unfamiliar cadences. The Moabites looked upon the travelers with wary, curious eyes, recognizing instantly that these were wanderers from the parched hills to the west, refugees driven from their homes by hunger. Elimelech found a small plot of land on the outskirts of a bustling agricultural town called Moabite Shomron, near the fertile plains where the river Arnon nourished the soil. They pitched a temporary tent of coarse goat hair cloth beneath the sprawling branches of a large terebinth tree, setting up their hearth in a land where they were entirely dependent on the goodwill of strangers and the mercy of an alien sky. The first few years in Moab were marked by a fragile, quiet endurance. The land provided. The earth yielded its grain in abundance, and Elimelech and his sons worked tirelessly from dawn until dusk, clearing fields, harvesting crops, and trading their surplus grain in the bustling local markets. Slowly, the immediate panic of starvation receded, replaced by the quiet rhythm of daily labor in a foreign place. Yet, survival in a strange land always exacts a quiet tax upon the soul. They leave as aliens, watching the religious festivals of their neighbors, festivals dedicated to Chemosh, the national god of Moab, with a mixture of guarded detachment and quiet isolation. They kept to themselves, maintaining their ancestral traditions around their evening hearth, whispering prayers to the God of Israel in a land where his name was unknown. Mahlon and Chilion grew into strong, broad-shouldered men under the Moabite sun. Their youth, combined with the steady supply of bread, filled out their frames, and as they worked the threshing floors alongside local laborers, they began to weave themselves into the fabric of the local community. They learned the Moabite tongue fluently, spoke easily with the merchants in the market square, and walked the village paths with the casual confidence of young men who had come of age in this rolling, green land. And then, quietly, inevitably, the boundaries began to blur. It happened on a warm, golden afternoon during the barley harvest, when the air was heavy with the scent of crushed chaff and sun-warmed earth. Mahlon had been working the large threshing floor at the edge of the plateau, using a wooden sledge pulled by an ox to break the husks from the grain. As the afternoon wind picked up, tossing the golden chaff into the air to separate the heavy kernels, a group of local families gathered to watch the work and share food in the shade of the stone walls. Among them was a family of local prominence, people of substance who farmed wide tracts of the Arnon Valley. With them were their daughters, young women whose laughter carried across the dusty courtyard like the sound of clear water over stones. Mahlon paused, leaning against his wooden fork, his breath catching slightly as his eyes met those of a young woman standing near the olive press. Her name was Ruth. She possessed a striking, quiet grace, her dark hair braided with silver threads and cowrie shells, her eyes deep and observant, holding a curious mixture of gentle warmth and an inner strength that seemed far beyond her years. Across the courtyard, Ruth looked back at the tall, sun-bronzed Israelite whose family had come from the barren hills across the sea. In that quiet exchange of glances across the dusty chaff, the rigid walls of separation began to dissolve, yielding to the ancient, irrepressible human pull toward connection. In the months that followed, the attachment deepened. Despite the traditional boundaries that kept Israelites and Moabites apart, love found a quiet way through. Mahlon sought her hand, and after long, careful discussions between the families, discussions marked by mutual respect and the practical realities of two cultures meeting, an agreement was reached. Ruth left her father's house and came to dwell under the goat-hair tent of the Hebrew sojourners as Mahlon's wife. Shortly thereafter, Lion, too, found his heart drawn to a young Moabite woman of gentle spirit named Orpah. The wedding celebrations were modest, blending the quiet, solemn customs of the Israelites with the warm, festive music and shared meals of the Moabite countryside. For a brief, sunlit season, the tent beneath the terebinth tree was filled with the sound of young laughter, the rustle of women's garments, and the soft murmur of domestic life. Naomi, watching her two foreign daughters-in-law learn the ways of her household, watching Ruth grind the grain with a steady, graceful rhythm, and listening to Orpah's light, musical laughter, felt the sharp edges of her initial bitterness soften into a cautious, guarded affection. Ruth, in particular, possessed a rare depth of character. She observed Naomi with a quiet, intuitive reverence, learning not just the recipes of the Judean kitchen, but the hidden sorrows and quiet dignity of the older woman's heart. Yet, life in a foreign land is fragile, and the soil of Moab, for all its green fertility, could not shield them from the unpredictable, biting winds of human mortality. It began with a lingering cough that Elimelech could not shake as the autumn damp settled into the river valleys. He was not an old man, but the cumulative weight of the years, the grinding anxiety of the famine, the grueling physical labor of carving out a new life in the wilderness, the silent, relentless homesickness that gnawed at his spirit, had worn down his constitution. One evening, as the silver moonlight washed over the dusty, winding pathways leading down toward the Arnon, Elimelech lay down upon his sleeping mat inside the quiet tent. His breathing was shallow, his forehead hot with a quiet fever. Naomi sat beside him through the long hours of the night, holding his calloused hand, whispering words of comfort and old prayers from the hills of Bethlehem, her heart contracting with a cold, terrifying certainty. The dawn brought no relief. As the first pale rays of sunlight struck the canvas of the tent, Elimelech drew his final breath, his spirit slipping away quietly into the silence. He died far from his ancestral soil, unable to fulfill his quiet promise to return to the limestone hills of Judea. The grief that swallowed the household was deep and suffocating. They buried him on a quiet hillside overlooking the green plains of Moab, marking his grave with a simple cairn of stones, a permanent anchor of sorrow in a foreign land. Naomi stood beside the mound of earth, her son supporting her on either side, her face dry-eyed and mask-like with a shock so profound that it felt as though a part of her own chest had been hollowed out. She was a stranger in a strange land, an aging widow whose protector and provider had been taken from her. Yet, mercifully, she was not alone. Her sons, though grieving deeply for their father, surrounded her with protective devotion, and Ruth and Orpah moved through the tent with hushed footsteps, tending to her every need with a tender, unwavering loyalty that spoke louder than any words. For 10 years, the household held together in this fragile equilibrium of shared sorrow and quiet perseverance. Mahlon and Chilion worked the fields, providing bread for the women, while Naomi found her purpose in guiding the younger households, pouring her wisdom, her memory of God's covenant, and her quiet strength into the hearts of Ruth and Orpah. Yet, tragedy, once it gains a foothold in a family's history, is a relentless shadow. 10 years after Elimelech's passing, a sudden, virulent sickness swept through the lower plateaus of Moab, a swift, unyielding fever that spared neither young nor old. Within the span of a single month, the remaining pillars of Naomi's world collapsed entirely. Mahlon fell first, his strong frame broken by the fever within a matter of days. And before the dust of his grave had even settled, Chilion followed his brother, slipping away into the quiet dark. The tent beneath the terebinth tree fell utterly silent. The grief that descended upon Naomi this time was not merely sorrow, it was an absolute, crushing emptiness that felt heavier than the famine that had driven them out of Bethlehem 10 years prior. She sat upon the floor of the tent, her garments torn, her graying hair dusted with ashes, rocking back and forth in a wordless agony. She had left Judea with a husband and 2 sons, seeking bread to save their lives. Now, she was an old woman, entirely alone, bereft of every man whose name carried her lineage, stranded in a foreign country with nothing left to lose. Outside, the golden fields of Moab continued to ripple in the warm afternoon breeze, indifferent to the human devastation unfolding beneath the canvas roof. The sun-baked barley field stretched out toward the horizon, glowing with a rich, mocking warmth, while inside the tent, a mother sat in the gathering shadows, wrapped in a mantle of profound and absolute desolation, wondering how much more a human heart could endure before it simply ceased to beat. Outside, the golden fields of Moab continued to ripple in the warm afternoon breeze, indifferent to the human devastation unfolding beneath the canvas roof. The sun-baked barley field stretched out toward the horizon, glowing with a rich, mocking warmth, while inside the tent, a mother sat in the gathering shadows, wrapped in a mantle of profound and absolute desolation, wondering how much more a human heart could endure before it simply ceased to beat. Elimelech was gone. The man who had once walked the limestone hills of Bethlehem with a steady, hopeful stride, whose voice had comforted her through the first lean whispers of famine, now lay cold beneath a simple cairn of stones upon a foreign hillside. Naomi looked down at her hands, palms calloused from years of wandering, fingers empty of everything that mattered. They had fled Judea to escape the biting claws of hunger, trading their ancestral soil for the rolling, sun-bleached plains of Moab, only to find that death could cross borders just as easily as men. The silence within the tent grew heavy, thick with the scent of dry earth and old wool. Her sons, Mahlon and Kilian, stood near the entrance, their broad shoulders slumped with a grief that seemed too large for their youth. They were men now, forced into premature maturity by the sudden fracture of their world. They looked at their mother with a helpless, aching tenderness, unsure of how to comfort the woman who had always been the anchor of their lives. Days bled into weeks, and the stark, immediate terror of loss settled into a dull, persistent ache. Life in the plains of Moab did not stop for their mourning. The wind continued to sweep down from the high plateaus, rattling the dry scrub and stirring the dust across the threshing floors where strange farmers labored under a relentless sun. Naomi realized, with a cold sinking in her chest, that they were entirely adrift. They were foreigners in a land of different gods, different customs, and different tongues, possessing no land of their own, and protected by no extended clan. Yet, human resilience is a quiet, stubborn thing, taking root even in the most barren soil. As the seasons turned and the bitter edge of their grief softened into a fragile acceptance, the rhythm of daily survival began to reassert itself. Mahlon and Kilian had to work, to trade their labor for bread, returning to the threshing floors and the olive groves of their Moabite neighbors. And in the quiet spaces between labor and rest, the natural currents of youth began to pull them toward the daughters of the land. It was during the second summer following their father's passing, when the air shimmered with the intense heat of midday, that Mahlon first brought Ruth to the modest stone-walled dwelling they had rented on the outskirts of a Moabite village. Ruth was a young woman of quiet grace, with dark, luminous eyes that held a depth of perception unusual for her years. When she spoke, her voice had the soothing cadence of a gentle stream running over smooth stones, and her hands moved with a quiet, efficient purpose that immediately eased some of the tension in Naomi's weary heart. Kilian, not long after, found his own companionship in Orpah, a vibrant young woman whose quick laughter and tender heart brought a much-needed warmth back into the shadowed rooms. Orpah possessed an innate cheerfulness, a natural gift for finding light in difficult places, and her presence was like a sudden breeze that swept through the stifling heat of the plains. For a brief, deceptive window of time, the household breathed again. The courtyard, once silent save for the sighs of a grieving mother, began to echo with the sound of youthful voices, the clatter of clay water jugs, and the soft murmur of evening conversations. Naomi watched from the shade of the porch as her sons built lives alongside these two Moabite women, weaving the threads of their foreign families into a fragile, domestic tapestry. There was a tender harmony in those ordinary days. In the cool of the evening, when the fierce glare of the sun finally surrendered to the soft silver of twilight, the five of them would sit together on woven mats outside the threshold, sharing simple meals of barley bread, lentils, and tart olives. Ruth would often sit near Naomi, her dark eyes observant and full of an unspoken reverence, anticipating the older woman's needs before they were even voiced. Orpah would recount some small, humorous incident from the village market, coaxing a rare, genuine smile from Naomi's weathered face. In those moments, Naomi allowed herself to hope that perhaps the bitter cup had passed from them. She saw in Ruth a steadfast spirit, a quiet endurance that seemed anchored to something far deeper than the shifting sands of circumstance. Ruth did not merely adapt to her new Israelite family, she embraced them with a wholehearted devotion, learning the ancient stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that Naomi would recount in the quiet evenings, listening with an intense, respectful fascination. Orpah, too, endeared herself to everyone, her affectionate nature binding her closely to Kilian and cementing her place as a cherished daughter of the household. The borders between nations seemed to blur in the gentle light of domestic routine. Israel and Moab, historically estranged and often locked in bitter rivalry, found a fragile reconciliation in the quiet union of these young hearts. Naomi looked upon her daughters-in-law with a growing affection, recognizing in them a profound source of solace. They were young, full of life and unwritten tomorrows, and in their presence, the heavy shadow of Elimelech's absence lifted just enough for the household to feel like a true home once more. The sun-baked barley fields of Bethlehem felt very far away, a distant memory of limestone hills and ancestral graves swallowed by the mists of time. Here, under the vast, open skies of Moab, life settled into a predictable, comforting cadence. The rhythmic, metallic swish of sickles slicing through dry golden stalks under a blazing midday sun became the soundtrack of Mahlon and Kilian's daily labor, a reassuring reminder of productivity and sustenance. Yet, leave on the frontier of survival is rarely permitted to settle into permanent peace. Just as the family had begun to plant their roots deep into the Moabite soil, a subtle, chilling shift occurred beneath the surface of their quiet happiness. It began with a cough. A dry, persistent rasp that Mahlon tried to dismiss with a tired smile as he wiped the sweat from his brow after a long day in the fields. Naomi heard it from across the courtyard, and a cold, familiar dread, a phantom she thought she had buried alongside her husband, suddenly awoke in her chest. She watched her eldest son move with a sluggishness that could not be blamed on the heat alone, his broad shoulders beginning to curve inward under an invisible weight. Within weeks, Mahlon was confined to the sleeping mat, his strength ebbing away like water sinking into dry sand. Ruth sat by his side day and night, her face pale, her dark eyes reflecting a desperate, quiet agony as she bathed his fevered brow with cool water and whispered words of comfort that seemed to echo in an empty room. There was no medicine in the plains of Moab that could reach the invisible decay consuming him from within. When the end came, it was as swift and merciless as a sudden desert storm, leaving Ruth a widow before she had even truly known the fullness of wifehood. The grief that descended upon the household this time was not the stunned silence of their first loss, it was a jagged, violent shock that threatened to tear the remaining fabric of their lives to shreds. Orpah wept openly, clinging to Kilian, who stood frozen in a mixture of profound sorrow for his brother and a paralyzing terror for his own body. And then, as if the cruel architects of fate were determined to complete their devastating work, Kilian began to fade. The same mysterious, wasting sickness that had stolen Mahlon seized the younger brother with an unyielding grip. Kilian fought with the desperate energy of youth, his eyes searching the faces of his mother and his wife for a lifeline that no one could provide. Orpah poured every ounce of her vibrant spirit into caring for him, holding his hands through the long, agonizing nights, refusing to leave his side even as the fever burned brighter and hotter. But love, however fierce and tender, could not ransom a life from the grip of death. Barely a year after Mahlon was laid beneath the stones, Kilian was carried out to the very same hillside, leaving behind a silence so absolute and crushing that it seemed to swallow the very air in the courtyard. The tent, once filled with the warmth of young families and the hopeful promise of tomorrow, was now inhabited solely by 3 women: Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah. 3 childless widows, standing utterly alone in a world that offered no safety, no status, and no future for women without men. In the ancient, patriarchal society of the time, a woman's security was entirely bound to her father, her husband, or her sons. Without them, a widow was a leaf caught in a gale, entirely vulnerable to the harsh economics of survival, stripped of legal standing, and exposed to the whims of a society that viewed them as financial burdens. To be a widow was difficult. To be a childless widow in a foreign land was a sentence of quiet, grinding desperation. Naomi sat once again in the gathering shadows, but this time the mantle of desolation was heavier, darker, and infinitely more bitter. She looked at Ruth, whose face was a mask of carved stone, her youthful beauty muted by an unspeakable sorrow. She looked at Orpah, whose bright, cheerful spirit had been broken upon the anvil of repeated tragedy, now weeping silently into her hands. The divine providence that Naomi had once trusted, the unseen hand that she had believed guided the steps of her family, now felt like a crushing weight. In the quiet bitterness of her soul, she felt as though the Almighty had reached out and emptied her life of every single thing that gave it meaning. Outside, the indifferent winds of Moab continued to sweep across the golden plains, rustling the dry stalks under a vast, unheeding sky. The women sat together in the deepening gloom, bound not only by the ties of family, but by a shared, unfathomable emptiness, waiting for a dawn that seemed as though it would never come. The morning sun rose over the rolling hills of Moab not with a gentle warmth, but with a harsh, unyielding glare that bleached the landscape into shades of pale ochre and dusty bone. Days melted into one another like wax running down the sides of a neglected hearth, each one marked by the heavy silence that lived within Naomi's stone-walled courtyard. Yet, on a wind-swept morning when the air tasted faintly of distant rain, a rumor drifted across the borderlands from the west, a whisper carried by merchants driving heavily laden donkeys along the ancient trade routes. In Bethlehem of Judah, the drought had finally broken. The skies, which had locked their doors against the earth for years, had opened in mercy, and the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. The news struck Naomi like a sudden, cool breeze sweeping across a fevered brow. She sat upon a low wooden stool in the shaded corner of her courtyard, her calloused hands resting motionless in the lap of her dark, threadbare mourning garments. For so long, her mind had been a closed fortress of grief, impenetrable to hope, convinced that her story in the land of her husband and sons had reached its bitter, unalterable end. But as the words echoed in the courtyard, "Bread in Bethlehem, the famine is over," something deep within her weathered frame stirred. The numbness that had insulated her heart for years began to fracture, replaced by a sharp, piercing ache for home. She thought of the limestone hills of Judea, pale and terraced with ancient olive groves. She remembered the scent of wild thyme crushing beneath her sandals after a spring shower, and the deep, rich brown of the soil that awaited the plough. Moab had been a place of refuge once, a desperate sanctuary when the bellies of her family had hollowed with hunger, but it had ultimately become a graveyard. Here, the soil held the bones of Elimelech, her husband, and the damp earth of the local cemetery claimed Mahlon and Chilion, the two sons who had been the light of her fading eyes. To stay was to let the silence consume her entirely. With a slow, deliberate effort, Naomi pushed herself up from the stool. Her joints ached with the stiffness of years and sorrow, but her spine straightened with a sudden, resolute dignity. She gathered her daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, and announced her intention to arise and return to the country of her birth. Preparations for the journey began in the hushed, twilight hours before dawn, while the stars still hung like silver frost in the indigo sky. The courtyard was filled with the soft rustle of woven travel bags being packed with the few meager possessions they owned: a spare woolen tunic, a clay oil lamp, a small leather water skin. Orpah moved through the dim light with a heavy, hesitant grace, her eyes frequently filling with unshed tears as she looked around the familiar stone walls of the home she had known since childhood. Her heart was a battleground of conflicting loyalties. She loved Naomi deeply, looking upon the older woman not merely as a mother-in-law, but as a pillar of wisdom and gentle kindness through the darkest days of their shared bereavement. Yet, the thought of crossing the great Rift Valley, climbing the steep, unforgiving ascents into a foreign land where she knew neither the language, the customs, nor the God of the Israelites, filled her with a quiet, paralyzing terror. Ruth, by contrast, moved with a steady, unhurried focus. Her dark eyes, usually so soft and observant, burned with a quiet, internal fire. She folded garments with precise care, her thoughts racing far ahead of the dusty road they were about to tread. Since the death of Mahlon, her husband, Ruth had watched Naomi bear her grief like a crown of thorns. She had seen the way the older woman shrank from the world, and she recognized that to let Naomi walk this long, perilous road back to Judah entirely alone would be a cruelty too great to bear. By the time the first pale streak of amber light painted the eastern horizon, the three women stood just outside the wooden gate of the compound, looking down the winding dirt track that meandered southward toward the border. They walked together for several miles, the silence between them thick with unspoken thoughts as the morning heat began to bake the dust beneath their sandals. The road sloped gently downward, leading them away from the cultivated fields of Moab and toward the wild, broken terrain that dropped precipitously into the Jordan Valley. Here, the landscape opened up into vast, panoramic vistas of rolling hills fading into a hazy, violet distance. Naomi stopped beside a gnarled terebinth tree whose sparse branches offered a brief pool of shade against the climbing sun. She turned to face the two young women who had walked beside her through the deepest waters of sorrow. Her face, lined with the topography of a hard life, softened with a profound, aching tenderness. She looked at Orpah and then at Ruth, realizing the immense sacrifice she was asking of them. To follow her meant turning their backs on everything familiar, their families, their ancestral gods, their culture, and the very real possibility of ever finding another husband or building a secure home. "Go," Naomi said, her voice trembling slightly as she reached out to take their hands, her touch rough and warm against their skin. "Return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you find security, each of you, in the house of her husband. She pulled them close, pressing her forehead against first Orpah's and then Ruth's, wrapping her arms around them in a fierce, maternal embrace that seemed charged with all the unsaid words of their shared grief. At that moment, the dam broke. Orpah buried her face in the fold of Naomi's traveling cloak, her shoulders shaking with deep, racking sobs. The realization of the finality of the parting rushed over her like a cold wave. She had loved this Israelite woman, but the pull of her homeland, the familiar voices of her kin, the security of her father's household, the God she had known since infancy, tugged at her with an irresistible, anchoring strength. She looked down the long road that led back into Moab, where the smoke from familiar hearths curled lazily into the morning air, offering safety and predictability. "Mother," Orpah whispered, her voice choked with tears as she pulled back and pressed a long, lingering kiss upon Naomi's wrinkled cheek. "I cannot. Forgive me." With tears streaming down her dusty cheeks, Orpah turned away. She lingered for a heartbeat, casting one last, sorrowful glance toward Ruth, who stood silently beside Naomi, before she began the long, solitary walk back up the dusty trail toward Moab. Her figure grew smaller and smaller against the vast, sun-drenched landscape until she disappeared entirely over the crest of the hill, swallowed by the familiar comforts of the land of her birth. Naomi stood motionless, watching her depart. A heavy sigh escaped her lips, not of anger, but of understanding and lingering sorrow. She turned her gaze then to Ruth, expecting, perhaps even hoping, that the practical gravity of the moment would persuade the young Moabite woman to follow her sister-in-law's sensible path. "Look," Naomi said softly, gesturing with a frail hand toward the empty road where Orpah had vanished. "Your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Turn back after your sister-in-law." The wind swept across the hillside, rustling the dry golden grass at their feet, carrying with it the distant, haunting cry of a hawk wheeling across the vast, indifferent sky. Ruth did not look back. She stood firmly on the sun-baked path, her hands clasped loosely together in front of her tunic, her dark eyes fixed upon Naomi with an intensity that brooked no argument. There was no hesitation in Ruth, no trembling fear of the unknown. In the quiet chambers of her heart, a profound and irrevocable choice had already been made days ago, forged in the crucible of shared tears and quiet endurance. To leave Naomi now would be to tear out the very beating heart of her own existence. She had looked past the borders of her birthplace and seen a destiny far greater than personal comfort or cultural safety. Ruth stepped closer to Naomi, her movements deliberate and absolute, and wrapped her arms around the older woman's waist, pressing her face against Naomi's shoulder. "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you," Ruth said, her voice clear, steady, and resonant against the quiet vastness of the hills. "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also if anything but death parts me from you." The words hung in the warm air, suspended like sacred vows carved into invisible stone. Naomi stared down at the young woman, her breath catching in her throat. She saw in Ruth's dark, unwavering eyes a loyalty so fierce, so pure and unyielding, that it felt like a sudden shaft of divine light piercing through the heavy clouds of her despair. For the first time in years, the cold knot of bitterness in Naomi's chest loosened just a fraction. She realized that she was not returning to Bethlehem empty after all. She was carrying with her a treasure more precious than gold, a love that transcended borders, bloodlines, and grief. Seeing that Ruth was steadfastly determined to go with her, Naomi said no more. She gently rested her hand upon Ruth's dark hair, a silent acknowledgement of a bond that could never be broken. Together, the two women turned their faces toward the west. They stepped out onto the winding, dusty pathway that led down, ever down, toward the deep rift of the Jordan Valley and the steep, limestone ascents of Judah. The sun climbed higher into the cobalt sky, casting long shadows behind them as they walked forward into an uncertain future, bound by an extraordinary, unbreakable thread of human devotion and divine providence. The long road from the sun-bleached hills of Moab down to the Jordan Valley was a descent through shifting layers of heat and silence. Day after day, the two women walked the winding tracks, their sandals kicking up fine clouds of chalky dust that clung to the hems of their garments. Orpah had turned back toward her father's house, her weeping swallowed by the dry desert wind, leaving behind an empty space that was quickly filled by a quiet, unyielding resolve. Ruth did not look back. Her dark eyes remained fixed on the horizon, where the distant, rugged mountains of Judah rose like jagged blue teeth against the pale sky. Every step was an act of quiet defiance against despair. Naomi walked with her head bowed, her joints aching with the accumulated weight of years and sorrow, leaning heavily upon a polished wooden staff she had cut from an acacia tree before they left the border town. Whenever the path grew too steep, or the midday heat pressed down upon them like a heavy woolen blanket, Ruth's hand would reach out, steadying the older woman's elbow, offering a silent anchor in a world that had stripped them both of everything they once held dear. They spoke very little as they walked. Words seemed superfluous against the vast, indifferent expanse of the wilderness that stretched out on either side of the track. Instead, they communicated in the rhythm of their footsteps, the shared cadence of their breathing, and the occasional tender glance exchanged when the path grew treacherous. Ruth carried the small leather water skin and a woven bag containing the few dried figs and barley cakes they had managed to trade for along the way. She rationed the water carefully, pressing the skin to Naomi's cracked lips at every meager shade they could find beneath the sparse branches of a tamarisk tree. As they descended deeper into the valley, the air grew thick and heavy, smelling of baked earth and wild thyme. The Jordan River appeared below them like a twisting ribbon of silver green, cutting through the arid floor before the final, grueling climb up into the hill country of Bethlehem. For Naomi, every landmark was a ghost. Every stone wall and ancient olive tree whispered names of the dead: Elimelech, Mahlon, Chilion. Her heart felt like a dry cistern, hollow and echoing with the memories of a life she had left behind as a prosperous wife and mother, and to which she was now returning as a broken, childless widow. "We are nearly there, Mother," Ruth murmured softly one afternoon, as the shadows began to lengthen across the limestone terraces. Her voice was like cool water, steady and untainted by the bitterness that gnawed at Naomi's soul. Naomi stopped, wiping a dusty forearm across her damp brow, and squinted up at the terrace slopes rising above them. Smoke curled lazily from stone chimneys in the distance. The harvest was beginning, She could smell it in the air, the sharp, sweet scent of ripening grain and dry stalks awaiting the sickle. Bethlehem, Naomi whispered, the name tasting like ash on her tongue. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the day she had departed this very valley a decade ago, fleeing a famine with a full house and a hopeful heart. Now she returned with empty hands and a spirit battered by grief. "Do not call me Naomi," she said, her voice trembling slightly with a mixture of pride and profound sorrow. "Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." Ruth stepped closer, her expression one of deep, unshakable tenderness. She did not argue or offer empty platitudes. She simply reached out and took Naomi's work-roughened hand in her own, her thumb gently stroking the back of the older woman's knuckles. "I am here," Ruth said simply. "Wherever you walk, I will walk. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." The declaration hung in the warm evening air, a quiet vow that seemed to settle over the dusty path like a benediction. Naomi looked down at their joined hands, and for the first time in years, a tiny crack appeared in the hard shell of her grief. She squeezed Ruth's fingers back, a fragile, wordless acknowledgement of a devotion that defied reason, geography, and custom. With renewed, albeit trembling steps, they turned the final bend in the road and crested the hill, entering the gateway of Bethlehem just as the evening shadows began to lengthen across the limestone plazas. The town had changed, yet remained stubbornly the same. Narrow alleyways wound between stone houses with flat roofs where families gathered in the cool of the twilight. As the two women walked through the central gate, travel-stained, dust-covered, and weary to the bone, heads turned. Women carrying clay jars of water stopped by the communal well, whispering behind calloused hands. Old men sitting upon the stone benches near the gate shaded their eyes against the low sun, trying to pierce the veil of dust and time that clung to the approaching figures. Then, a murmur rippled through the gathering crowd. Could it be Naomi? A woman near the well dropped her woolen spindle, her eyes widening in astonishment as she pushed through the crowd to get a closer look. Another woman, her face lined with age and sun, stepped forward, her hands flying to her mouth. "Naomi! Blessed be God, it is Naomi." The news spread through the square like wildfire. Neighbors and old acquaintances crowded around them, some weeping, others reaching out to touch Naomi's frayed cloak, marveling at her return while mourning the obvious losses etched into her posture. But as the townspeople pressed close with their exclamations of pity and surprise, Naomi raised a hand, her voice cutting through the chatter with a sharp, uncompromising edge. "Do not call me Naomi," she repeated, her voice carrying across the quiet square. "Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" A heavy, sympathetic silence fell over the crowd. People exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing the raw, bleeding wound of a mother who had buried her husband and both her sons in a foreign land. They saw the hollows in her cheeks, the slump of her shoulders, and they stepped back slightly, giving her grief the sacred space it demanded. Yet, even in the shadow of Naomi's bitter lament, eyes began to drift toward the young woman standing faithfully by her side. Ruth stood slightly behind Naomi, her posture humble yet completely composed. Her dark eyes surveyed the crowd without fear, her hand resting lightly on the crook of Naomi's arm. She was dressed in the fashion of Moab, a tunic of rich, earthy brown fastened with a braided cord, her dark hair bound simply under a linen headscarf that caught the golden light of the setting sun. Whispers began anew, this time concerning the stranger. Who was she? Why had she come to Bethlehem with the broken widow? "This is Ruth," Naomi said quietly, sensing the unspoken questions hanging in the air. A faint softening touched her hardened features as she looked sideways at her daughter-in-law. "The Moabite woman who returned with me from the fields of Moab. She has shown greater loyalty than I could have ever asked for." No one spoke against it. The sheer weight of Ruth's presence, a foreigner who had abandoned her own gods, her family, and her homeland to care for an aging, destitute Israelite widow, spoke louder than any formal introduction. In the quiet dignity of Ruth's bearing, the townspeople sensed something rare and profound, a thread of grace weaving its way through the fabric of their community just as the barley harvest was beginning to sweep across the valleys. That night, they slept in a small, modest stone room lent to them by a distant relative of Elimelech near the edge of town. The roof was made of rough-hewn timber and packed mud, and the floor was swept clean of dust, though the scent of the nearby threshing floors drifted in through the open wooden shutter. Ruth lay on a pallet of straw, listening to the steady, rhythmic breathing of Naomi in the corner. The journey was over, but the true test of their survival was just beginning. Morning broke with a brilliant splash of amber light across the limestone hills. The air was already warm, carrying the distant shouts of harvesters and the lowing of oxen as the town stirred to life. Ruth sat up on her pallet, smoothing down her tunic. She knew the reality of their situation. Love and loyalty could not grind grain or bake bread. They were penniless, dependent entirely upon the charity of strangers and the ancient laws of Israel that provided for the vulnerable. "Mother," Ruth said softly, as Naomi stirred and opened her eyes. "Let me go to the fields and glean among the ears of grain after someone in whose sight I might find favor." Naomi propped herself up on one elbow, looking at the young woman with a mixture of protective anxiety and deep admiration. She knew the dangers of the fields, the harsh sun, the rough labors, the vulnerability of a foreign woman working among strangers. Yet she also knew the provision embedded in the laws of her people, given by Moses generations ago, when the harvest was reaped. The corners of the fields and the fallen stalks were to be left for the poor, the widow, and the foreigner. "Go, my daughter," Naomi whispered, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time in days. Ruth stepped out into the crisp morning air, tying her headscarf securely under her chin. She walked through the awakening streets of Bethlehem, following the paths that led down into the sprawling, terraced valley floor where the barley fields stretched out like a golden sea beneath the rising sun. Hundreds of people were already at work, men swinging heavy sickles with practiced, sweeping motions, women and children following closely behind to gather the fallen stalks into bundles. The metallic swish of sickles slicing through dry golden stalks filled the air, a steady, hypnotic rhythm that echoed across the valley. The scent of crushed barley chaff, dust, and sweat hung heavy in the warm breeze. Ruth stood at the edge of a vast field, her heart beating a little faster against her ribs. She looked at the towering heaps of golden grain already beginning to form near the threshing floors, and then down at her own empty hands. Drawing a deep breath, she stepped into the field. She did not push her way forward or demand attention. Instead, she followed behind the reapers, quietly bending to pick up the stray stalks of barley that slipped from their grasp or were left behind in the haste of the harvest. Her movements were graceful, methodical, and tireless. Hour after hour, as the sun climbed higher into the blazing cobalt sky, baking the earth and turning the air shimmering and hazy, Ruth kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her fingers working with steady precision. The sun beat down upon her neck, drawing beads of sweat that trickled down her temples, but she did not stop. She paused only occasionally to wipe her brow with the back of her wrist or to take a small sip of water from the clay jug she had brought from the house. Around her, other gleaners, the poor, the fatherless, the destitute, worked with similar urgency, casting wary, sideways glances at the foreign woman with the dark, gentle eyes. Unbeknownst to Ruth, as she worked her way deeper into the rows of golden grain, the master of the field had arrived. Boaz, a wealthy and influential man of the clan of Elimelech, came down from Bethlehem to inspect the harvest. He was a man of noble character, tall and weathered by the sun, with a kind, perceptive gaze that missed very little. As he walked among the stacked sheaves, checking the quality of the grain and greeting his workers with traditional blessings, "The Lord be with you," his eyes caught sight of a figure moving with unusual grace and diligence among the reapers. He stopped, shading his eyes with a broad, calloused hand, and watched the young woman for a long moment. He saw the way she bent, the way she gathered the scattered stalks, and the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, setting herself apart from the rough-and-tumble crowd of casual gleaners. Boaz turned to the young man in charge of the reapers, a trusted overseer who stood nearby with a tally stick in his hand. "Whose young woman is that?" Boaz asked, his voice deep and resonant. The overseer straightened, wiping dust from his tunic. "She is the Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She asked us, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers.' She has been at it since early morning, resting only briefly in that little shelter over there." Boaz nodded slowly, a profound light of recognition and respect dawning in his eyes. He had heard the talk in the town market. He knew the story of Ruth's devotion to her mother-in-law, how she had left her entire world behind to shelter under the wings of the God of Israel. A deep wave of admiration stirred within him. He walked over toward the place where Ruth was working, his footsteps crunching softly on the dry stubble of the harvested earth. Ruth, sensing someone approaching, kept her eyes lowered, assuming it was merely another laborer or the overseer coming to warn her away from the rows. She reached down to pick up a particularly rich cluster of fallen barley. "Listen to me, my daughter," a rich, kind voice spoke from just above her. Ruth froze. She slowly straightened up, lifting her gaze to meet the eyes of the tall, bearded man standing before her. There was authority in his bearing, but immense gentleness in the lines around his eyes. "Do not go to glean in another field," Boaz said, his tone firm yet warm with reassurance. "And do not leave this place, but stay close by my young women. Watch which field they reap, and follow them. I have ordered the young men not to touch you or bother you. And when you are thirsty, go to the jars and drink from what the young men have drawn." Ruth's breath caught in her throat. She looked at him in stunned disbelief, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and profound gratitude. In a world where foreigners, especially Moabites, were treated with suspicion and contempt, this man was offering her safety, provision, and dignity. Overwhelmed, she bowed low, her face nearly touching the sun-baked earth. "Why have I found such favor in your eyes?" Ruth whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "that you should notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz looked down at her with a steady, compassionate gaze, seeing past her humble clothes and foreign accent to the core of her noble character. "It has been fully reported to me," Boaz answered, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet rows of grain, "all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and mother and the land of your birth, and have come to a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Ruth felt a profound warmth spread through her chest, pushing back the cold shadows of the long journey and the uncertainty of the past weeks. She placed a hand over her heart, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of leave and hope. "Let me find favor in your sight, my lord," Ruth replied softly, her voice steadying with quiet strength. "For you have comforted me, and have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants." As the midday sun reached its zenith, bathing the valley in a brilliant, shimmering glare of golden light, Boaz turned to her with a welcoming smile. "Come here at mealtime," he instructed gently. "Eat some of the bread, and dip your piece in the sour wine." When it was time for the midday meal, Ruth sat beside the reapers in the partial shade of a limestone outcropping. Boaz himself reached out and handed her roasted grain, more than she could possibly eat. She ate her fill, and even saved some to take back to Naomi. Throughout the afternoon, as the heat shimmered off the earth and the rhythmic swish of the sickles resumed, Boaz gave secret instructions to his young men. "Let her glean even among the sheaves," he told them quietly, "and do not reproach her. Indeed, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them so that she may glean them, and do not rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. When she beat out what she had gathered, the grains cascaded down into a heavy, overflowing heap, an entire ephah of barley, nearly 30 pounds of grain, far more than any ordinary gleaner could hope to gather in a single day. With the heavy sack hoisted upon her shoulder and the remaining roasted food wrapped carefully in a fold of her garment, Ruth turned her face back toward the winding path that led up into Bethlehem. The sun was dipping below the western hills, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of amber, violet, and rose. The weight of the grain upon her shoulder was heavy, but it was a good weight, the weight of provision, of survival, and of a quiet, providential turning of the wheel of fate. She walked up the hill with a lighter step than she had known in months, her heart brimming with a quiet, steady joy. Back in the modest stone house, Naomi was waiting, peering anxiously out through the wooden doorway as the shadows lengthened. When she saw the approaching figure of Ruth, laden down with a heavy sack of grain and walking with the unmistakable grace of quiet triumph, Naomi's breath caught in her throat. As Ruth stepped across the threshold and emptied the massive heap of barley onto the clean-swept floor, alongside the leftover roasted grain she had saved from her meal, Naomi stared in utter astonishment. "Where did you glean today?" Naomi asked, her voice trembling with wonder. "Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Ruth looked up, her dark eyes shining with the golden light of the evening, and smiled. "The name of the man who worked with today is Boaz," she said softly. Naomi froze, her hands flying to her mouth as a gasp of pure, unadulterated shock escaped her lips. For a long, suspended moment, the tiny room seemed to fill with an ancient, rushing wind, the sudden, breathtaking realization of a providence that reached far beyond their immediate sorrow. Tears welled up in Naomi's aging eyes, spilling over her weathered cheeks, but this time there was no bitterness in them. "Blessed be he of the Lord!" Naomi cried out, her voice ringing with a newfound strength that banished the shadows from the room. "He has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead." She reached out, taking Ruth's face between her trembling, calloused hands, looking deeply into the eyes of the young Moabite woman who had walked with her through the valley of the shadow of death. "The man is a close relative of ours," Naomi whispered, a profound, steady hope settling deep within her bones. "He is one of our close relatives, our guardian redeemer." Ruth leaned into the warmth of Naomi's touch, closing her eyes as the evening breeze rustled through the olive trees outside. The long journey from Moab was over. The bitterness of Mara was beginning to soften into the sweet, golden dawn of a new redemption, woven silently by hands unseen, grounded in an unfailing, unbreakable vow of human love and divine grace. The morning sun rose over the hills of Bethlehem not with a gentle amber glow, but with a sudden, searing brilliance that bleached the limestone terraces to a blinding white. Across the valley, the terraced slopes were a patchwork of muted ochre and dust, dotted with ancient olive trees whose silvery leaves shivered in the early thermals. In the small, modest stone house near the town's outer gate, the shadows still clung to the corners of the earthen floor. Naomi stirred, her joints aching with the familiar stiffness of age and sorrow, yet beneath the physical heaviness, a new current of energy pulsed through her veins. The name Boaz had hung in the warm night air like a promise. Ruth was already awake. She sat quietly on a low wooden stool, her fingers deftly weaving together a few stray reeds into a small carrying basket. Her dark eyes, usually shadowed by the lingering ghost of grief in Moab, held a quiet, steady resolve. She wore her coarse linen tunic, dusty from the long road, and draped a faded blue shawl over her head to ward off the coming heat. "Mother," Ruth said softly, her voice smooth and even as she looked up to see Naomi watching her from the threshold of the inner room. "The barley harvest has begun, and the reapers will already be making their way to the valley. Let me go to the fields. Perhaps I might find favor in the sight of someone there, and glean among the ears of grain behind whoever allows it." Naomi looked at the young Moabite woman, her daughter by choice, her sister in shared bereavement, and felt a lump rise in her throat. She remembered the laws of her people, ancient and generous, carved into the heart of the covenant. When the reapers swung their sickles through the terraced fields, they were forbidden to harvest the very edges, and the stalks that slipped from their grasp must be left behind for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. It was a provision born of mercy, but it required humility to claim. "Go, my daughter," Naomi whispered, reaching out to gently touch Ruth's shoulder, her palm rough and calloused. "May the God of Israel guide your steps." The walk down from the town into the valley floor was a descent into a sea of gold and dust. The path wound between stone walls stacked high with jagged rocks, flanked by wild thistles and parched turf. As Ruth reached the lower slopes, the air changed. It grew thick with the dry, sweet scent of crushed barley chaff and the heavy, earthy musk of sun-baked soil. All around her, the valley was alive with sound. From every direction, families, servants, and laborers were moving toward the vast, sprawling fields that stretched out beneath the town. The rhythmic, metallic swish of sickles slicing through dry golden stalks filled the morning air like a chorus of cicadas, accompanied by the low murmur of voices, the laughter of young women, and the occasional bray of a loaded donkey. Ruth kept her eyes cast downward, acutely aware of the curious, sometimes hard glances cast her way. In Bethlehem, a Moabite face was a rarity, a reminder of ancient feuds and foreign gods, and her plain, travel-worn clothes marked her instantly as an outsider. But hunger and the quiet determination to sustain Naomi banished any hesitation. She slipped quietly past the larger groups, seeking out a place where the harvesting was already underway. By an uncalculated turn of providence, her footsteps carried her toward a massive, well-tended tract of land near the center of the valley. Rows of towering barley stalks, heavy-headed and golden, rippled in the hot breeze like waves of sunlight. At the edge of this field, reapers moved with practiced, sweeping motions, their muscles gleaming with sweat as they gathered the grain into thick armloads, binding them with twisted straw. This field belonged to Boaz. Ruth did not know his land by its boundaries, nor did she recognize the tall, commanding figure of the master standing near the threshing area. She simply saw an expanse of grain where the reapers were plentiful and the harvest rich, and she approached the young foreman who oversaw the laborers. "Please," Ruth said, her voice clear and respectful, though her accent carried the distinct, melodic lilt of Moab. "Let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. I have come from early morning until now, and I only rested a little in the house." The foreman, a sun-weathered man named Caleb whose eyes had seen decades of seasons come and go, paused in his tallying. He looked at Ruth, at the quiet dignity in her posture, the honest fatigue in her eyes, and the modest way her shawl was pinned. He knew the rules of his master, and he knew the faces of the local poor who routinely haunted the harvest edges. This woman was different. There was a disciplined grace about her that commanded respect. "You may glean," Caleb said, his tone softening slightly. "Follow the young women who tie the sheaves. Stay close behind them. I have already ordered the young men not to touch you or cause you any trouble. And when you are thirsty, go to the jars and drink from what the young men have drawn." Overwhelmed by a kindness she had scarcely dared to hope for, Ruth bowed her face to the earth, touching her forehead to the dusty soil in deep gratitude. "Why have I found such favor in your eyes," she murmured, "that you should notice me, a foreigner?" Caleb wiped his brow with the back of a thick, calloused forearm and smiled faintly. "It has been fully reported to me," he said, his voice carrying over the rustle of the stalks, "all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you left your father and mother and the land of your birth, to come to a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given you by the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." With those words echoing in her heart like a quiet blessing, Ruth rose and set to work. The labor was grueling, relentless, and demanding. The sun climbed higher into the azure sky, transforming the valley into a vast, open-air kiln. The temperature soared, baking the earth and radiating heat up through the soles of Ruth's sandals. Dust kicked up by the feet of the reapers hung suspended in the shimmering air, coating her skin and lodging in her throat. Yet Ruth did not falter. She bent repeatedly from the waist, her fingers sweeping through the stubble to snatch up the stray stalks that the reapers missed. With practiced dexterity, she gathered them into her arms, tied them with a cord of grass, and laid them aside. Her muscles burned with a dull, throbbing ache, and beads of sweat carved clean paths through the dust on her cheeks, but her mind remained anchored in a profound, steady focus. She was doing this for Naomi. Every stalk she gathered was a brick in the foundation of their survival. As the morning wore on, the master of the field arrived. Boaz had come down from Bethlehem to inspect the harvest, his heart lifted in gratitude for the abundance of the season. He wore a simple, high-quality tunic of undyed wool, a wide-brimmed cloth hat shielding his face from the blistering glare. His beard was flecked with grey at the temples, marking a man of substance, maturity, and deep-seated integrity. As he walked the perimeter of his lands, exchanging traditional greetings with his workers, "The Lord be with you," and "The Lord bless you," his keen, observant eyes took in every detail of the operation. Then, amidst the movement of reapers and binders, his gaze fell upon a stranger. She was bending low near the rear of the working line, her dark hair catching the copper light of the midday sun as it escaped the edges of her blue shawl. There was a focused rhythm to her movements that distinguished her from the casual gleaners who often drifted through the edges of the fields. Boaz stopped in his tracks. He turned to Caleb, who was hurrying over with a clay tablet of figures tucked under his arm. "Whose young woman is that?" Boaz asked, his voice deep and resonant, carrying a tone of quiet authority. Caleb shaded his eyes with his hand, following the direction of the master's gaze. "That is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She asked me, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers.' She came, and has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter." Boaz stared at the distant figure of Ruth, a complex wave of emotion washing over him. News of the tragic return of Naomi had rippled quietly through the small community of Bethlehem weeks ago, the elderly, broken woman walking back into town with only a foreign daughter-in-law by her side, stripped of husband, sons, and property. Boaz, a close kinsman of Naomi's late husband Elimelech, had felt the sting of that tragedy keenly. He had intended to visit, to offer assistance, but the press of seasonal duties had delayed him. Now, looking across the golden expanse at this young Moabite woman laboring under the harsh sun to feed her aging relative, a profound sense of admiration stirred within his chest. He saw her loyalty, her quiet industry, and her utter lack of pretense. Without a word to Caleb, Boaz began to walk across the stubble toward her. Ruth was bent over a particularly stubborn cluster of stalks entangled in a dry thistle when a shadow fell across the patch of earth before her. She paused, straightening up slowly, expecting perhaps to find a foreman or a fellow laborer warning her of an impending cart. Instead, she found herself looking up into the face of the master of the field. Boaz stood tall before her, his expression warm, his eyes crinkling at the corners with a mixture of kindness and profound respect. The authority in his posture melted away, replaced by the gentle demeanor of a host welcoming a cherished guest to his table. "Listen closely, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field, nor go from here," Boaz said, his voice rich and steady, cutting through the ambient noise of the harvest. "Stay close by my young women. Watch which field they reap, and go after them. Have I not ordered the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Ruth's breath caught. She stared at him, her dark eyes wide with astonishment. In a world where outsiders and destitute women were routinely ignored, exploited, or treated with casual contempt, this wealthy landowner was treating her with the deference due to royalty. Overwhelmed by the sudden, overwhelming grace of the gesture, Ruth dropped to her knees, bowing her face once more to the hot, dusty earth. "Why have I found favor in your eyes?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, "that you should notice me, since I am a foreigner?" Boaz stepped forward, his movements deliberate and gentle, and gestured for her to rise. There was a quiet intensity in his gaze that spoke volumes without a single word of forced flattery. "It has been fully reported to me," Boaz answered, his voice dropping to a warm, confidential register, "all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and mother and the land of your birth, and have come to a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Ruth felt the words settle deep into her spirit, like cool water poured over parched earth. The last lingering traces of isolation, the cold weight of being a stranger in a strange land, began to dissolve under the weight of such genuine acceptance. "Let me find favor in your sight, my lord," Ruth whispered, her voice steadying with newfound courage. "For you have comforted me, and have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants." Boaz smiled, a rich, genuine expression that seemed to chase away the heat of the midday sun. As the shadows began to lengthen across the valley floor, signaling the approach of the midday meal, he turned toward the cluster of shade trees where the workers were beginning to gather. "Come here at mealtime," Boaz instructed, looking back over his shoulder with an encouraging nod. "Eat of the bread, and dip your piece in the vinegar." When the reapers sat down together on the dry grass beneath the sprawling branches of a large terebinth tree, Ruth sat down among them. She had expected to remain on the periphery, a silent observer of their fellowship. But Boaz did something that sent a ripple of quiet murmurs through the circle of laborers. He reached out and took a handful of parched grain, roasting it on the hot stones himself, and handed it directly to her. He piled roasted grain onto a wooden platter, adding fresh bread and offering it to her with his own hands. Ruth ate until she was fully satisfied, and even had food left over. As she rose to return to her gleaning, Boaz gave secret instructions to his young men, his voice carrying a quiet directive that brooked no argument. "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her," Boaz commanded quietly, a subtle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And let grain fall loosely for her from the bundles. Leave it so that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." Throughout the long, blazing afternoon, Ruth experienced a harvest unlike anything she could have ever imagined. Wherever she walked, golden stalks seemed to materialize just ahead of her path, as if the very earth were conspiring to provide for her. The reapers, catching the spirit of their master, deliberately dropped thick handfuls of barley into the stubble, making her work astonishingly fruitful. Her arms grew heavy, her muscles strained, but her heart was lighter than it had been since the day she buried her husband in the soil of Moab. When evening finally fell over the valley of Bethlehem, painting the sky in deep strokes of violet, burnt orange, and gold, Ruth gathered her day's labor. Using her outer shawl as a makeshift sack, she poured the gathered grain into the center, gathering the corners and hoisting it onto her shoulder. As she stood, she realized the sheer magnitude of what she held. She began beating out the grain she had gleaned, separating the golden kernels from the brittle chaff using a flat wooden paddle. As the chaff blew away on the evening breeze, she collected the clean, heavy grain into a heap. When she measured it, her breath hitched. An ephah of barley, nearly 30 pounds of rich, golden grain. Stunned by the abundance, Ruth hoisted the heavy load onto her shoulder and began the long, winding climb back up the hill toward Bethlehem. The stars were beginning to puncture the velvet dusk, glittering like silver dust scattered across the vast expanse of the Judean sky. The cool night air of the hills washed over her heated skin, bringing with it the scent of dust, rosemary, and baked earth. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door of the stone house, Naomi looked up from the low table where she sat by the dim light of an oil lamp. Her eyes widened in utter disbelief as Ruth stepped through the doorway, her shoulders bowed under the massive weight of the heavy shawl, her face glowing with the quiet triumph of the day. Ruth dropped the burden onto the earthen floor with a heavy, satisfying thud that echoed through the small room. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the leftover parched grain and bread that Boaz had handed her at midday, placing it gently on the table before her mother-in-law. Naomi stared at the mountain of golden grain, then at the food, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the heavy, perfect kernels. Tears welled in the old woman's eyes, spilling over her wrinkled cheeks, but for the first time in years, they were tears of profound, unadulterated wonder. "Where did you glean today?" Naomi asked, her voice barely a whisper, filled with a sudden, electric awe. "Where did you work? Blessed be the one who took notice of you." Ruth sank onto the wooden stool, the exhaustion of the day finally washing over her limbs, but a radiant smile lit up her dark eyes. "The name of the man who worked with me today is Boaz," Ruth answered softly. Naomi froze. The name hung in the quiet room like a bell tolling in a cathedral. For a long moment, the older woman could not speak, her breath catching in her throat as a vast, sweeping realization washed over her weary soul. The grief that had anchored her to the dust for so long seemed to lift, dissolved by a providence so intricate, so tender, that it defied human design. "Blessed be he of the Lord," Naomi whispered, her voice breaking with emotion as she reached out to cup Ruth's dusty face in her trembling hands, her thumbs gently brushing away the remnants of the harvest dust. "He has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead." Naomi looked deep into the eyes of her daughter-in-law, a steady, unbreakable hope anchoring every fiber of her being. "This man is a close relative of ours," Naomi said, her voice dropping to a solemn, reverent register. He is one of our guardian redeemers. Ruth leaned into the warmth of Naomi's touch, closing her eyes as the cool evening breeze drifted softly through the open doorway, carrying the quiet promise of a new dawn. The long journey from the dry hills of Moab was over, and the bitter winter of their sorrow was giving way to a golden, enduring redemption. The days that followed fell into a steady, dust-moted rhythm under the blazing overhead sun of Bethlehem, where the sharp, metallic swish of sickles slicing through dry golden stalks became the steady heartbeat of the valley. Every morning, long before the fierce heat shimmered off the limestone hills, Ruth joined the ranks of the gleaners at the edge of the barley fields. Her fingers, once accustomed to the softer looms of Moab, quickly grew calloused as they gathered the fallen heads left behind by the reapers. Yet she was never alone in the furrows. Boaz had made his protective intentions clear, ensuring that his young men pulled extra handfuls from the bundles on purpose, leaving them in the rich dust for her to find without the humiliation of begging. When evening finally descended, bringing with it the heavy, sweet scent of crushed barley chaff drifting across the darkening landscape, Ruth would retrace her steps up the winding path to Naomi's stone-walled cottage. On one particularly luminous evening, as the silver moonlight began to wash over the dusty pathways leading down from the hills, Ruth returned with her shawl laden far beyond normal measure. She carried an entire ephah of winnowed grain, alongside the extra roasted corn that Boaz's own hand had given her during the midday meal. Naomi, who had been sitting quietly in the dim interior of the house with her hands folded over her knees, looked up in genuine astonishment as Ruth emptied the heavy folds of her garment onto the floor. The mound of golden grain spilled across the packed earth, catching the pale amber light of the oil lamp. "Where have you gleaned today?" Naomi asked, her voice trembling slightly as she leaned forward, her dark eyes wide with a sudden, breathless surprise. "Where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Ruth sank onto a low wooden stool, her shoulders aching with a profound, satisfying weariness, though her dark eyes shone with a quiet, resolute light. She told Naomi everything, recounting the precise way the wealthy landowner had spoken to her, the protective circle his young men had drawn around her labor, and the deliberate kindness that had governed every hour of the scorching day. She spoke the name that had hung suspended in the quiet air of Bethlehem like a hidden promise. "His name is Boaz," Ruth whispered, watching as the shadows across Naomi's weathered face seemed to shift and lift, replaced by something resembling a dawn breaking after a long, freezing night. A stillness settled over the small room, thick with the weight of history and unspoken providence. Naomi stared at the pile of golden barley, her mind racing backward through the tangled genealogy of her family, through the bitter years of famine, through the lonely graves left behind in Moab, and finally landing upon the ancient laws of their people. A flicker of hope, cautious, fragile, and fierce, rekindled deep within Naomi's darkened heart, banishing the cold despair that had held her captive for so long. "He is a close relative of ours," Naomi said softly, the name of the Redeemer resting on her tongue like a key turning in a long-locked door. "One of our family redeemers. He has shown us that his unfailing loyalty, his chaste, did not die when our husbands were buried in the soil of Moab." In the days that followed, Ruth continued to glean in the fields of Boaz, moving faithfully through the harvest right alongside the female servants until the barley harvest and the wheat harvest were both safely completed. But while the physical labor sustained their bodies, the quiet hours in the stone cottage became charged with a deeper, more calculated purpose. Naomi watched the rhythms of the valley from her doorway, calculating the shifts in the wind, the timing of the threshing, and the ancient customs that governed the land of her birth. The threshing floor was situated on the high, breezy ridge outside the town, exposed to the evening drafts that swept down from the Judean hills. It was a circular space of packed, hardened earth where the harvested grain was trampled by oxen or beaten with wooden flails to separate the nutritious kernels from the dry, papery chaff. As the harvest drew to its close, Boaz would spend his evenings at the threshing floor, overseeing the winnowing as the farmers tossed the crushed stalks into the air with wooden forks, letting the wind carry the worthless debris away while the precious grain fell back to the earth in a steady, golden cascade. One afternoon, as the golden light of the late sun began to lengthen across the floorboards of the cottage, Naomi called Ruth to her side. The older woman's face was set with a quiet, resolute determination, her eyes bright with a daring strategy born of desperation and faith. "My daughter," Naomi began, her voice steady and low, carrying the weight of ancient tradition. "Should I not seek a home for you, where you may be well provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose young women you have been, our relative?" Ruth listened intently, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against her ribs as Naomi laid out a plan that defied ordinary convention and walked straight into the heart of ancestral law. It was a bold maneuver, steeped in the customs of the Levirate and the guardian-redeemer, designed to awaken a man of honor to his highest moral obligation. "Wash yourselves, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your best cloak," Naomi instructed, her hands resting earnestly on Ruth's shoulders. "Then go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking." The instructions were precise, every detail calculated to ensure both discretion and undeniable intention. Ruth absorbed each word, her loyalty to Naomi matching the depth of her courage. She knew the social perils of the venture, the whispers that could circulate in a small, insular town if things went awry, but her trust in Naomi's wisdom and in the quiet, righteous character of Boaz overcame any lingering hesitation. "Observe carefully where he lies down," Naomi continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. And he will tell you what you are to do." Ruth nodded slowly, the gravity of the upcoming night settling over her like a heavy, cool mantle. "All that you say I will do," she murmured, her voice unwavering. As the sun dipped below the rugged horizon, painting the western sky in bruised shades of purple and amber, Ruth prepared herself. She washed away the dust of the barley fields, smoothing her dark hair, and draped herself in her finest garment, a cloak that smelled faintly of cedar and clean linen, distinct from her working attire. She stepped out into the deepening twilight, leaving the safety of the cottage behind as she descended the winding, stone-lined path that led from the quiet town down to the bustling, dusty expanse of the threshing floor. The night air was warm, carrying the dry, sweet scent of crushed straw and the distant, low murmur of men finishing their evening meal. The threshing floor was a place of rough labor and earthy abundance, yet tonight it felt suspended in a quiet, expectant stillness under the vast canopy of southern stars. Ruth moved cautiously along the shadows of the perimeter, her footsteps silent against the packed earth, keeping her eyes fixed on the center of the activity where the heaps of harvested grain lay like sleeping golden mounds. She spotted Boaz immediately. He was sitting near the largest heap of winnowed barley, surrounded by his workers as they shared a final meal of bread, roasted grain, and simple wine. The atmosphere was jovial and relaxed, filled with the deep, rumbling laughter of men whose labor had yielded a bountiful harvest under difficult skies. Ruth stayed hidden in the protective cover of the olive trees at the edge of the ridge, watching the tall, broad-shouldered landowner as he interacted with his men, noting the genuine warmth in his voice and the effortless authority he commanded without raising his tone. Hour by hour, the noise began to subside. One by one, the weary laborers rolled themselves into their heavy wool cloaks, seeking the comfort of sleep directly on the straw-strewn ground around the grain piles to guard their harvest from thieves in the dead of night. The fire settled into a bed of glowing red embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the rugged ground. Boaz, having eaten and drunk his fill, and feeling a deep, contented satisfaction in his heart, rose and walked toward the far side of the grain heap where a soft pallet of straw had been prepared. He lay down quietly, pulling his cloak tightly around his shoulders against the midnight chill that always followed the desert heat, and soon his breathing fell into the slow, steady cadence of deep sleep. Ruth waited, her heart thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird, counting the seconds in the vast silence. The silver moonlight washed over the open floor, casting sharp, distinct lines of light and shadow. She took a slow, deep breath, gathering every ounce of her courage, and stepped out from the shelter of the olive grove. Moving with absolute silence, she glided across the open ground like a ghost upon the wind. The air around the grain heap was thick with the rich, dusty aroma of chaff and sweet grain. She approached the sleeping form of Boaz, her senses heightened to every subtle sound, the distant hoot of an owl in the ravine, the rustle of a dry leaf, the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of the man's chest. True to Naomi's precise instruction, Ruth stepped quietly to the foot of his pallet. With trembling fingers, she gently lifted the edge of the heavy woolen cloak that covered his feet, folding it back, and lay down quietly in the cool, exposed space at his feet. She did not speak, nor did she move, offering her silent presence as a profound question directed to the conscience and honor of the man she had served all season. The midnight hours ticked by, the stars slowly shifting their celestial positions across the vast, ink-black sky. The air grew perceptibly colder, the chill seeping up from the packed earth and brushing against Ruth's uncovered feet. She remained perfectly still, her mind a quiet sanctuary of resolve, trusting entirely in the providence that had brought her across deserts and borders to this exact patch of earth. Then, suddenly, the stillness shifted. Boaz stirred in his sleep. A sudden draught of cold night air must have brushed against his uncovered limbs, breaking through the warm cocoon of his dreams. He shifted his weight, pulling his hand down toward his feet to readjust his garment, and his fingers brushed against something unexpected, not the rough straw of the threshing floor, nor the hard edge of a wooden tool, but the soft fabric of a garment and the leavings warmth of a human presence. Boaz jerked awake instantly, every instinct of a frontier landowner snapping into sharp, alert focus. He sat bolt upright, his heart leaping into his throat, his hand sweeping across the dark ground to identify the intrusion. "Who is there?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, resonant whisper that cut sharply through the quiet night air. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. The shadows stretched long and thin under the moonlight. Ruth lifted her head, looking up through the dimness into the stunned, wide eyes of the man towering slightly over her in the straw. "I am Ruth, your servant," she answered, her voice steady, clear, and remarkably calm, carrying no trace of fear, only a profound, unwavering dignity. "Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." The silence that followed her words was not cold, nor was it the heavy stillness of rejection. It was the vast, breathless quiet of a world caught between what had been and what was about to be. Boaz stood motionless in the shadowed expanse of the threshing floor, the coarse straw whispering slightly beneath his sandals as a stray gust of night wind swept down from the Judean hills. He looked down at the woman kneeling before him. The silver moonlight caught the fine dust clinging to the hem of her simple garment and illuminated the quiet, steadfast resolve shining in her dark eyes. There was no tremor in her hands, no frantic pleading in her posture. She had placed her entire future, her dignity, and her hope for restoration into the open palms of his honor, asking not for charity, but for the sacred covenant of kinsman-redeemer. A profound emotion stirred within Boaz, rising from the deep wells of his integrity and his quiet piety. For months, ever since he had first watched her tirelessly gleaning behind the reapers in the sun-baked barley fields, he had harbored a quiet admiration for her. He had seen the way she worked from dawn until the heat shimmered off the earth, asking for nothing, enduring the unspoken prejudices of the village with a gentle, unyielding grace. He knew the story of her loyalty to Naomi, the profound, unbreakable chaste that had caused a young Moabite widow to leave her homeland, her gods, and her family behind to walk dusty roads into a strange and uncertain future. Slowly, deliberately, Boaz lowered himself onto the straw, the dry stalks rustling like dry leaves in autumn. He did not recoil, nor did he offer empty platitudes. Instead, his gaze softened, filled with a profound respect that bridged the ancient divides of nation and lineage. "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter," Boaz murmured, his voice low, resonant, and steady, carrying easily through the cool night air. "You have made this last kindness greater than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." Ruth felt the remaining tension in her shoulders slowly begin to dissolve, replaced by a deep, anchoring warmth that reached all the way to her chest. She bowed her head slightly, letting out a long, quiet breath she had scarcely realized she was holding. "And now, my daughter, do not fear," Boaz continued, leaning slightly forward, his presence a fortress of calm in the vast, open night. "I will do for you all that you ask. For all the assembly of my people knows that you are a worthy woman." The weight of her grief, the lingering ghost of sorrow that had shadowed her steps ever since the graves had been dug in the dust of Moab, seemed to lift just a fraction, melting away under the genuine kindness of his words. She was no longer just an outsider, a foreign widow gathering scraps in the corners of a harvested field. In the eyes of this honorable man, she was recognized for the depth of her character, for the quiet courage that defined her soul. Yet, even in the warmth of this reassurance, Boaz's brow furrowed slightly with the sober weight of duty. Honor required order, and justice required that things be done rightly under the laws of the elders and the customs of Bethlehem. "And now," Boaz said, his tone turning thoughtful, measured by the practical realities of the morning to come. "It is true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I." Ruth listened, her heart skipping only briefly before steadying itself again. She trusted him. Whatever the path, she knew he would not forsake her. "Remain this night," Boaz instructed gently, standing up and motioning for her to rest safely in the shelter of the winnowing floor. "And in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." So Ruth lay at his feet until the morning, resting quietly in the shadowed corner of the threshing floor while the stars wheeled slowly across the vast velvet sky above Bethlehem. The heavy, sweet scent of crushed barley chaff hung in the air, a comforting reminder of the earth's quiet abundance. The night was peaceful, unbroken by the cares of the world, cradled by the certainty that providence was at work in the ordinary, quiet moments of human lives. As the first pale streaks of amber and rose began to bleed across the eastern horizon, tinting the rolling hills of Judea with the promise of a new day, the sounds of waking life began to stir. Somewhere in the valley below, a rooster crowed, its sharp call echoing against the stone walls of the village. A stray goat bleated, and the cool morning breeze picked up, rustling the olive groves that clung to the terraced slopes. Boaz stirred before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. He knew that the gate of the city, the ancient stone threshold where the elders and judges sat to render civic decisions and witness legal transactions, would soon begin to bustle with merchants, farmers, and village officials. If justice was to be done, it must be done in the light of day, openly and without hesitation. He looked down at Ruth, who was already waking, her dark eyes clear and calm in the grey dawn light. "Let it not be known that a woman came to the threshing floor," Boaz said softly, his voice full of protective care, mindful of her reputation in a village quick to whisper. Then, reaching for the empty shawl she had brought with her, he instructed her, "Bring the cloak that is upon you and hold it." Ruth held out the coarse fabric, and Boaz poured into it 6 measures of barley, lifting the heavy grain with steady hands. He hoisted the bundle onto her shoulders, the weight substantial and reassuring, a tangible sign of provision before she even stepped foot back into Naomi's courtyard. With a quiet step, Ruth slipped away from the threshing floor while the morning shadows were still long and blue upon the ground. The path wound downward through the terraced hills, the dust cool beneath her sandals. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp, clean fragrance of wild thyme and dew-kissed stone. She walked with a new lightness in her stride, her mind at peace, carrying the heavy sack of grain as if it were a feather. When she arrived back at the house, the door was ajar, and Naomi was waiting, her eyes bright with anxious affection and sleepless anticipation. "How did you fare, my daughter?" Naomi asked eagerly, reaching out to take Ruth's hands, searching her face for any sign of disappointment or distress. Ruth did not keep her waiting. With a soft smile touching the corners of her mouth, she recounted everything the man had done for her. She told her of the conversation under the stars, of Boaz's unwavering promise, and of the legal hurdle that must first be cleared by the closer relative. And then, unlacing the shawl, she poured out the 6 measures of barley onto the floor, the golden grain spilling out in a rich, gleaming heap. "He gave me these," Ruth said, her voice steady and warm. He said, "You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law." Naomi stared at the grain, then looked up at Ruth, a profound sense of wonder washing over her lined face. The bitterness that had once gripped her heart upon her return from Moab, the dark season when she had wept and called herself Mara, touched by the hand of the Almighty, seemed far away now, dissolved by the quiet unfolding of an unexpected grace. "Wait, my daughter," Naomi said, her voice filled with a deep, maternal certainty, "until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest until he has settled it today." True to her word, Boaz wasted no time. He walked with purpose through the winding, dusty pathways of Bethlehem until he reached the city gate. The massive stone archway, worn smooth by centuries of travelers and traders, was already beginning to hum with activity. Men in woven tunics and travel-stained robes gathered in the shade of the stone walls, discussing the price of grain, the condition of the flocks, and the legal matters of the community. Boaz climbed the stone steps and sat down, waiting quietly. Before long, the very man he had spoken of, the close relative whose name the custom of the time left unrecorded, known simply as a kinsman of Naomi's late husband Elimelech, happened to pass by. "Come over here, friend, sit down here," Boaz called out, his voice carrying clearly across the stone courtyard. The man turned, nodding, and stepped over to sit beside him on the stone bench. Boaz then looked around the bustling gateway and motioned to 10 of the elders of the city, men with weathered faces and white beards, wise in the customs and laws of Israel. "Sit down here," Boaz said to them. And they sat down, forming a small, solemn circle right there in the heart of the noisy, sunlit gate. The contrast between the frantic commerce of the market and the quiet gravity of the circle of elders created a hush of anticipation. All around them, life moved on, donkeys brayed, merchants argued over silver shekels, and children ran laughing through the dust, yet within this small, focused space, a destiny was being shaped. Boaz turned to the kinsman-redeemer, his gaze direct, honest, and unhurried. "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech," Boaz stated plainly, his voice measured and clear. "So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people." The kinsman blinked, caught slightly off guard by the abruptness of the business. Land was a valuable commodity, a permanent anchor for a family name and inheritance. To buy it meant securing the estate, adding to one's own fields and wealth. He stroked his beard, considering the financial advantage. "If you will redeem it, Boaz continued, laying out the terms with absolute integrity, giving the man his lawful first right. "But if you will not redeem it, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." The man considered the proposition for a moment, the wheels of calculation turning in his mind. Then, looking up with a ready nod, he answered, "I will redeem it." A collective murmur rippled through the gathering of elders. The transaction seemed simple enough, a straight exchange of land, an asset returning to the family bloodline. But Boaz was not finished. He had woven the legal strands together with care, knowing that the land and the woman were bound by a sacred, inseparable duty. "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi," Boaz added quietly, his voice cutting cleanly through the murmur of the crowd, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." The kinsman stopped short. The color seemed to shift slightly in his expression as the full financial and personal implications of the statement settled over him. To redeem the land was an investment, to marry the foreign widow and raise up an heir whose inheritance would be split with the existing estate, an heir who would carry the name of Elimelech and Mahlon upon land that the kinsman might otherwise pass entirely to his own children, was quite another matter. The kinsman shook his head slowly, lifting his hands in a gesture of withdrawal. "I cannot redeem it for myself," the man replied, his voice dropping as he calculated the cost to his own household and future. "If I do, I might ruin my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Silence settled over the circle at the city gate. It was the moment Boaz had prepared for, the moment toward which all the quiet providences of the harvest season had been steadily marching. According to the custom in Israel in former times concerning redeeming and exchanging, to confirm a transaction, a man would pull off his sandal and give it to the other. It was a public, binding testament, simple yet absolute. In the presence of the elders and all the people, the kinsman reached down, unlaced his leather sandal, and pulled it from his foot, handing it across to Boaz. Boaz took the sandal, holding the worn leather in his hand. He turned to the elders and to all the people gathered around the gateway, his voice ringing out with a quiet, triumphant resonance that brooked no uncertainty. "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon," Boaz declared, his eyes bright with resolve. "Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." From the surrounding crowd of elders and townspeople, a unified chorus of affirmation rose into the warm morning air. "We are witnesses," the elders answered solemnly. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem." The transaction was complete. The law had been fulfilled, justice had been satisfied, and the path of redemption stood wide open, bathed in the brilliant, unclouded sunshine of the Judean noon. When evening fell once more upon Bethlehem, the dust of the city gate had settled, and the quiet peace of the countryside returned, wrapping the rolling hills in a soft, breathable blanket of cool night air. The frantic pace of commerce gave way to the gentle, rhythmic sounds of crickets chirping in the dry grass and the soft whispering of the olive leaves overhead. There were no crowds now, no legal disputes, no anxious waiting in the shadows. In the courtyard of Boaz's house, beneath a sky teeming with a million brilliant stars that watched in silent approval over the ancient land, Ruth and Boaz stood together. The journey from the sorrow-laden hills of Moab, across dusty roads and sun-baked barley fields, had found its destination. Boaz reached out, his calloused, gentle hand taking Ruth's, a gesture of profound respect and unbreakable partnership. There was no need for grand speeches. The quiet certainty of their shared future spoke louder than words. The grief that had once defined her early days in Bethlehem was now thoroughly washed away by a love as steady and enduring as the hills around them. The night deepened, wrapping them in a profound, unbroken stillness. The earth rested, cradled in the quiet assurance of restoration, knowing that out of ordinary sorrow and quiet loyalty, a new lineage had been planted, one that would endure through the generations, carrying the light of hope into the heart of history. The morning sun rose over Bethlehem not with a sudden flash of brilliance, but with a gradual, amber warmth that coaxed the mist from the valleys and painted the limestone walls of the city in shades of honey and rose. Long before the heat of the day could settle upon the stone houses and dusty courtyards, the town gate hummed with the quiet, purposeful energy of a new day. The city gate was more than mere an entryway of heavy timber and thick, weathered stone. It was the heart of civic life, the place where justice was measured, contracts were sealed, and the elders of the town sat in solemn judgment upon matters that shaped the destiny of families. The dust beneath the arched shadows of the gate had settled into a smooth, packed floor, worn by centuries of sandaled feet, the hooves of laden donkeys, and the slow, deliberate pacing of men who held the weight of tradition upon their shoulders. Boaz walked toward the gate with a stride that was at once measured and resolute. The morning breeze caught the hem of his tunic, carrying with it the faint, comforting scent of sun-baked wheat and the clean smell of the open fields where he had spent so many arduous, fulfilling hours. Yet today his mind was fixed not upon the harvest, nor upon the yield of the threshing floors, but upon a matter of profound restoration. He knew the ancient laws of the community as intimately as he knew the furrows of his own land, laws designed to protect the vulnerable, to preserve inheritance, and to ensure that no family name was ever truly lost to the silence of extinction. As he reached the broad stone platform just inside the gate, he saw them, the elders of Bethlehem, men whose hair and beards were frosted with white, whose eyes had witnessed decades of drought and plenty, sorrow and joy. They were gathering for the morning council, settling onto the stone benches carved into the thickness of the wall, leaning upon polished wooden staves, and greeting one another with the low, resonant murmurs of long-acquainted neighbors. Boaz did not wait to be summoned. He walked directly toward the assembly, offering a respectful greeting that acknowledged their wisdom and standing. Then, without a moment of hesitation, he turned his gaze toward the open pathway leading up from the fields and down from the hills, watching for a very specific figure. The custom of the town demanded that matters of inheritance and redemption be settled publicly, in the presence of the gatekeepers and the community's most trusted witnesses. And as the morning light grew brighter, the man whom Boaz sought came walking down the lane, the kinsman-redeemer whose legal claim to Elimelech's estate preceded his own. The man, whose name history would leave unnamed save for the title of a nameless relative, walked with a cautious, guarded gait. He was a landowner of careful habits and calculated risks, a man who measured every venture by its immediate yield and its safety against potential loss. He had come toward the city to oversee his own affairs, perhaps to check the market prices of grain or to consult with merchants regarding the season's produce. Boaz raised his hand, his voice carrying clearly across the stone courtyard. "Ho, come aside, my friend," Boaz called out, using a familiar, courteous address. "Sit down here." The man paused, blinking against the sudden brightness of the open square, and then turned his steps toward the assembly. He looked at Boaz, and then at the circle of venerable elders seated upon the stone benches. A faint flicker of apprehension crossed his features, for men of consequence did not summon others to the gate without a deliberate purpose. "Sit here," Boaz repeated, gesturing to the empty stone seat directly beside him. The man complied, settling heavily onto the bench. With a nod from Boaz, 10 of the town elders stepped forward from the surrounding courtyards and seated themselves in a solemn semicircle around the two men, their presence transforming a chance encounter into a formal court of law. The crowd of passers-by slowed their pace, lingering at a respectful distance to witness the proceedings, for the transfer of ancestral land was a matter of deep public interest in a community bound by blood, soil, and covenant. Boaz turned to his kinsman, his expression calm, open, and entirely devoid of artifice. The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows across the stones at their feet, and the murmur of distant town life seemed to recede, leaving only the steady, deliberate cadence of the unfolding negotiation. "Naomi, who has returned from the country of Moab," Boaz began, his voice resonant and steady, carrying easily to every ear in the assembly, "is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech." At the mention of Elimelech's name, the kinsman's posture shifted slightly. His eyes narrowed with a calculating glint, and a thin, satisfied smile touched the corners of his mouth. Land was a rare and precious commodity, permanent, tangible wealth that anchored a family's legacy in the soil of Judah. To acquire an additional parcel of fertile acreage, especially at a time when Naomi was in desperate financial straits and eager for relief, was an opportunity that rarely presented itself without complication. "I thought I should inform you," Boaz continued, watching the man's expression closely, "and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, tell me, that I may know. For there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." The kinsman leaned forward, resting his hands upon his staff. The hesitation that had marked his initial approach vanished, replaced by the eager calculation of a man who saw an immediate advantage. Without land, a family's history faded into the dust. With it, his own borders would expand, his estate would grow more secure, and his standing among the elders would be permanently enhanced. "I will redeem it," the man replied promptly, his voice clear and firm, eager to secure the bargain before any other voice could intervene. The elders murmured quietly among themselves, some nodding in approval of the straightforward transaction, others looking toward Boaz to see how he would respond to the swift forfeiture of his own secondary claim. The morning air grew slightly warmer, thick with the scent of dust and baking bread drifting from a nearby courtyard, but within the shaded precinct of the gate, the atmosphere remained taut, focused, and profoundly still. Boaz did not flinch. He allowed a brief, deliberate silence to settle over the assembly before he spoke again, his tone shifting from one of simple property transfer to the deeper, more complex obligations that bound the ancient laws of inheritance together. "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi," Boaz said, every word measured and deliberate, "you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." The effect of those words upon the kinsman was instantaneous and profound. The eager confidence that had illuminated his face a moment before drained away as if a sudden shadow had fallen across the sun. He stiffened, pulling his hands back from his staff as though the very wood had grown hot to the touch. To buy the land was a sound investment, to marry a foreign widow, a woman of Moab, whose people stood outside the formal covenants of Israel until brought in by grace, and to raise up children whose firstborn legal claim would belong not to his own household, but to the deceased Mahlon and the impoverished house of Elimelech, was an entirely different matter. It was a complication of names, an entangling of bloodlines, and a potential drain upon his own personal estate and inheritance. The kinsman looked at Boaz, his mind racing through the columns of risk and reward, weighing the cost to his own sons and his own immediate security. If he raised up children through Ruth, that estate he had just claimed would ultimately be divided, passing not to his own direct lineage, but back into the restored line of Elimelech and Mahlon. The financial sacrifice suddenly outweighed the tangible gain. "I cannot redeem it for myself," the kinsman said quickly, his voice losing its earlier resonance and dropping into a defensive, hurried tone. "I would endanger my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." A quiet ripple of understanding passed through the circle of elders. In those days, long before written deeds became the universal currency of commerce, a custom of profound symbolic weight governed the relinquishment of rights. It was a physical manifestation of resolve, a tangible seal upon a spoken covenant that left no room for future dispute or regret. The kinsman reached down to his foot. With a swift, practiced movement, he unfastened the leather thongs of his sandal, pulled it from his heel, and handed it across the space between them to Boaz. This was the public attestation, the handing over of the shoe, signifying that the one who relinquished his right walked away from the ground, transferring his authority, his place, and his responsibility entirely into the hands of another. The sun caught the dusty leather as Boaz accepted it, holding the sandal steady and high enough for every witness, elder, and passerby to see clearly. Boaz turned his gaze from the kinsman to the circle of venerated elders, his face illuminated by a quiet, steady triumph that had nothing to do with personal ambition and everything to do with faithfulness. The weight of the transaction rested securely in his palms, not merely as a piece of property, but as a sacred trust. "You are witnesses this day," Boaz proclaimed, his voice ringing out with absolute clarity across the bustling square, "that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Kinsman and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." From every corner of the gate assembly, the elders and the gathered townspeople answered with a single, resounding chorus of affirmation. "We are witnesses," they declared, their voices blending into a deep, harmonious roar that echoed off the ancient limestone walls. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem, and may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." The pronouncement hung in the warm morning air like a benediction. The legal obligations had been fulfilled openly, justly, and without a single shadow of deceit. The complex machinery of law, custom, and community had turned precisely as it was designed to turn, lifting the burden of desolation from a grieving family and anchoring them once more in the rich, enduring soil of the land. Boaz stood from the bench, the elders rising respectfully in his wake to clasp his forearm in congratulation. The transaction was complete. The fields of Elimelech were restored, the name of the dead was preserved, and the young woman from Moab, whose loyalty had put the faithfulness of native sons to shame, was now bound to the lineage of Bethlehem by the unbreakable ties of law and love. As Boaz walked away from the gate and down the familiar, dusty pathways leading toward his estate, the morning heat began to radiate softly from the earth, filling the air with the rich, dry fragrance of the surrounding hills. He carried the kinsman's sandal not as a trophy of conquest, but as an instrument of peace, a token of a promise fulfilled and a future securely planted. Farther down the hill, in the quiet courtyard of Naomi's modest dwelling, Ruth sat beneath the shade of a sprawling fig tree, her hands occupied with the gentle, rhythmic task of sorting through a basket of freshly gleaned grain. The harsh winds of grief that had once swept through her life like a desert storm had entirely subsided, replaced by the deep, tranquil rhythm of a new dawn. She did not need to be at the gate to know the outcome, an inner stillness, as profound as the hills of Bethlehem, assured her that the long journey of sorrow had finally reached its home. The shadows beneath the trees grew shorter as the sun climbed to its zenith, bathing the land in a brilliant, golden luminescence. The story of Ruth and Boaz was no longer merely a private tale of survival in a time of judges and turbulence. It was woven inextricably into the destiny of the earth itself. Out of emptiness had come fullness, out of alienation, belonging, and out of ordinary loyalty, a royal line that would carry the light of hope through the generations, anchoring the heart of history in the quiet, steadfast grace of an enduring love. The limestone walls of the courtyard caught the last apricot light of the evening, holding the warmth of the day long after the sun had dipped below the western ridge of the Judean hills. Inside the low-roofed dwelling, the air was still and sweet with the scent of olive oil lamps and sun-dried linen. There was a quietness in the house that evening, not the heavy, suffocating silence of the years gone by, but a breathing, leaving stillness, the kind that settles over a home when the storm has passed and the fields outside lie heavy and golden with the promise of harvest. Naomi sat upon a woven mat near the low wooden doorway, her hands resting softly in her lap. The lines that time and deep sorrow had carved so bitterly into the corners of her mouth had long since softened, smoothed away by years of unexpected grace. She looked across the room to where Ruth sat by the window. The young Moabite woman was leaning slightly toward the fading light, her dark, gentle eyes fixed on the small bundle cradled against her breast. A quiet wonder hung in the space between them. For so long, the house of Naomi had been defined by what was missing, by empty chairs at the evening meal, by the ghosts of a husband and sons buried in a foreign soil, by the hollow echo of a name that had once meant pleasantness but had tasted only of bitterness. Now, the room was full. It was filled with the soft, rhythmic breathing of new life, a sound more precious than any music the valley of Bethlehem had ever known. Ruth looked down at the child, her thumb gently tracing the smooth curve of a tiny cheek, marveling at the quiet miracle of his existence. He was a sturdy boy, bearing the quiet strength of Boaz in the broad architecture of his brow and the gentle, luminous spirit of his mother in the dark, wondering gaze he occasionally turned toward the world. They had named him Obed, the one who serves, because he was the servant of their restoration, the leaving bridge connecting a fractured past to an unbounded future. Slowly, with the cautious grace of one who has known the weight of years, Naomi pushed herself up from the mat and crossed the earthen floor. Ruth looked up, a soft, welcoming smile touching her lips, and gently shifted the bundle into Naomi's outstretched arms. The older woman held the child close, drawing in the sweet, clean scent of him, milk and sun-warmed skin and new breath. A tremor passed through Naomi's weathered hands, not from weakness, but from the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of her joy. For years, she had believed her story was finished, that her name would fade away into the dry dust of Moab, remembered only as a cautionary tale of loss. Instead, the tapestry of her life had been unraveled only to be rewoven with threads of gold and crimson she had never thought to see. Tears welled in Naomi's eyes, catching the flickering amber glow of the oil lamp, but they were tears born of a profound, healing peace. She pressed her cheek softly against the baby's fine, dark hair, whispering a blessing so tender it seemed scarcely louder than the sigh of the evening wind through the olive groves outside. "Blessed be the Lord," Naomi murmured into the quiet room, her voice steady and rich with a gratitude that spanned the generations, "who has not left you this day without a Redeemer. May his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Ruth leaned her head against Naomi's shoulder, the two women holding fast to one another around the small, warm life that bridged their souls. The alienation that had once marked Ruth's steps when she first crossed the border from Moab, a stranger in an unfamiliar land, gleaning in the margins of a field with quiet desperation, was entirely gone. She was no longer an outsider looking in. She was a daughter of this house, a matriarch of this soil, her loyalty woven into the foundational stone of Israel's history. Outside, the hills of Bethlehem settled deeper into the indigo shadows of twilight. The silver moonlight began its slow, steady ascent over the terraced hillsides, washing over the stone terraces, the sleeping vineyards, and the quiet threshing floors where Boaz had first noticed the steadfast woman who would change the course of his house. The land rested under the vast, starry canopy of the Judean sky, breathing out the heat of the day in a cool, fragrant sigh. Boaz stepped quietly through the low entryway, bringing with him the fresh, earthy scent of the fields and the cool night air. His tunic was dusted with the fine chaff of the harvest, and his face, weathered by the sun and lined with the honest labor of a landowner, softened the instant his eyes found the two women and the child. He paused for a moment, letting the profound peace of the scene wash over him. He had walked the boundary stones of his inheritance that evening, looking out over the rolling hills that descended toward the Dead Sea, knowing that the land was not merely his own, but a trust passed down through time. The law of redemption, which he had so eagerly and honorably fulfilled at the city gate, was not merely a legal transaction of property and names. It was the mechanism of a divine providence that operated quietly through the ordinary choices of ordinary people. It was the expression of chaste, that towering, unshakable covenant loyalty that bridged nations, erased divisions, and bound human hearts together in unbreakable solidarity. Boaz crossed the room with a quiet, deliberate tread and knelt beside Naomi and Ruth. He reached out a large, calloused hand, gently touching the tiny, curled fist of the child resting against Naomi's chest. The baby's fingers curled instinctively around Boaz's thumb, a small, fierce grip that seemed to hold the weight of all tomorrow. A deep, resonant sense of fulfillment settled over Boaz. He looked from the child to Ruth, seeing in her dark, serene eyes the quiet endurance that had weathered the graves of Moab and found its home beneath the sheltering wings of the God of Israel. In her, The bitter cup had been turned to sweetness. In his arms, the barren earth had yielded a harvest that would outlive them all. "He is a fine boy," Boaz said softly, his voice a low, comforting rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. "Strong. He has your spirit, Ruth. He will walk these fields with his head held high." "He belongs to the promise," Ruth answered softly, her voice melodic and clear, carrying the quiet certainty of one who no longer feared the morrow. The household grew stiller still as the night deepened. Boaz sat with them on the woven mat, the three of them forming a circle of warmth and protection around the new life that had been gifted to their hands. There was no need for grand speeches, no need for the clamor of the world outside. The drama of the judges, the cycles of rebellion and rescue, the turmoil of a land that did not know its own mind, seemed a million miles away from this quiet room in Bethlehem, where peace had finally taken up permanent residence. Through the open window, the night breeze stirred the silver leaves of the olive trees, carrying the faint, sweet scent of wild thyme and dry earth up from the valley. A lone cricket hummed its steady, hypnotic rhythm in the courtyard wall, marking the passage of time not with urgency, but with a soothing, predictable cadence. Naomi shifted slightly, easing her tired bones, and handed the sleeping child back to his mother. Ruth received him with effortless tenderness, settling back against the cushions as she began to hum a low, wordless lullaby, a tune she had known in the hills of Moab, now taking root and blossoming beneath the starlit sky of Judah. The melody wound its way through the room, light as thistledown, wrapping around the hearts of those present and pulling them down into a profound, untroubled rest. Naomi closed her eyes, the last lingering shadows of her grief finally dissolving into the rich, warm soil of a restored legacy. She had leave to see the winter of her life turn miraculously into spring. Her name, once whispered with pity in the market square, would now be carried forward through the bloodline of this child, a living testament to the truth that no life is ever truly finished so long as loyalty and love remain. Boaz reached out, extinguishing the small clay lamp by the doorway. The sudden darkness did not feel oppressive, rather, it was a velvet mantle dropped gently over the world, inviting all things to cease their striving and surrender to the night. The amber glow faded, replaced by the cool, silvery wash of moonlight that spilled across the floorboards, painting long, pale bars of light across the room. In the soft illumination, the contours of the dwelling softened. The woven baskets, the jars of oil and grain, the sleeping mats, all of it faded into the quiet background of a world at peace. The tension that had gripped the land in the days of the judges, the hunger that had driven a grieving family across a dangerous desert, the uncertainty of a widow standing in a stranger's field, all of it had resolved into this single, perfect moment of stillness. Ruth held Obed close against her heart, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his tiny life harmonizing with her own. Her journey from the dust of Moab to the harvest fields of Bethlehem was complete. She was a foreigner no longer. She was a pillar of a house, a mother in Israel, a daughter of the covenant whose steadfast love had unlocked the storehouses of heaven. The wind outside died down completely, leaving the night wrapped in a vast, cathedral-like silence. The hills of Bethlehem rolled outward under the moon, vast and ancient, cradling the sleeping village in their stony palms. Down in the valley, the barley fields lay dormant and receptive, their stubble catching the silver light, dreaming already of the winter rains that would one day waken the earth once more. And high above the quiet landscape, the stars wheeled slowly across the fathomless deep of the night sky, fixed in their eternal courses, shining down upon a world that was safe, held, and deeply loved. Out of emptiness, fullness, out of darkness, dawn. The story had found its harbor, and the heart of history beat softly, evenly, in the dark and blessed peace of the night. The morning sun climbed slowly over the eastern ridge of the Judean hills, casting long, amber shadows across the threshing floors that dotted the outskirts of Bethlehem. Long before the heat of the day could bake the dust into a shimmering haze, the air retained a cool, crisp mountain purity, carrying the distant scent of wild thyme and wood smoke from the stone houses huddled together on the slope. Inside the small dwelling where Naomi now lived, surrounded by the quiet hum of renewed life, the morning light filtered through the woven lattice of the window, painting bars of gold across the packed earthen floor. Ruth stood quietly by the hearth, her movements measured and tranquil as she tended a small clay pot of simmering lentils, the steam rising in gentle, curling wisps toward the rough wooden beams overhead. Her mind drifted back across the immense expanse of years and miles, to the red clay hills of Moab, where the wind sang a very different song through the dry scrub, and where her youth had been spent under the shadow of towering basalt cliffs. She remembered the day she had first walked this path, a stranger in foreign clothes with a heart heavy with the cold ash of grief, her hand resting in Naomi's. The journey from Moab had seemed interminable, a grueling trek across the Jordan Rift Valley where the earth dropped away into scorched salt flats before rising steeply into the terraced hills of Judah. Every step had been an act of sheer endurance, fueled only by an inexplicable loyalty, that profound, stubborn chase that refused to let go when everything else had been stripped away. Yet looking around the room now, seeing the small tokens of kindness left by neighbors who had once whispered behind closed doors, she felt the profound reality of a larger current carrying her forward. She was no longer an outsider gazing through a veil of sorrow. The soil of Bethlehem had received her, and her story had become inextricably woven into the destiny of the land itself. Across the room, Naomi stirred from her mat, her joints aching with the pleasant weariness of a matriarch whose house was once again filled with laughter and purpose. The bitterness that had once curdled her spirit like spoiled wine had been completely washed away, replaced by a deep, luminous peace that seemed to radiate from her very presence. She caught Ruth's eye and smiled, a quiet, knowing expression that bridged all the unspoken history between them. "The air this morning smells of rain," Naomi said softly, her voice rich with the cadence of years. "Not yet, perhaps, but the wind has shifted from the south. The cisterns will fill before the first sowing." "The fields are ready," Ruth replied, turning from the hearth with a small wooden bowl in her hands. "Boaz mentioned yesterday that the plowmen would begin turning the lower terrace by the end of the week, once the last of the late figs are gathered." The mention of Boaz brought a warm, tender light to Naomi's eyes. The union between Ruth and the wealthy landowner had restored not only their name and property, but had infused the entire clan of Elimelech with a vibrant, unexpected future. Their child, little Obed, who was now sleeping soundly in a woven basket near the door, represented the golden thread connecting the past sorrow to a limitless horizon. Later that morning, as the sun reached its zenith and the village grew quiet under the heavy blanket of midday heat, Ruth took the opportunity to walk out toward the edge of the terraced olive groves. The leaves of the ancient trees shimmered in the pale light, showing their silvery undersides every time a stray breeze rustled through the branches. Below her, the valley stretched out in a mosaic of green and gold, divided by dry stone walls built by generations of farmers who had coaxed life from these stubborn, limestone-ribbed hills. In the distance, the road wound its way downward toward the wilderness of Judah, a serpentine path of white dust disappearing into the shimmering distance. Travelers occasionally moved along that road, merchants carrying spices from Gilead or herdsmen moving their flocks between seasonal pastures. Ruth watched them with a quiet detachment, marveling at how a life could be so completely transformed. She remembered the sheer terror of standing in the Moabite wheat fields years ago, watching her young husband Mahlon draw his final breath, the world narrowing down to the hollow echo of her own heartbeat. She had thought then that her story was finished, that the final page had been written in the ink of desolation. Instead, the unseen architect of her days had been weaving a much grander tapestry, one that utilized every thread of sorrow and joy, displacement and belonging. She thought of Orpah, her sister-in-law, who had chosen to turn back toward the familiar gods and comfortable grief of her Moabite home. There was no judgment in Ruth's heart for Orpah's choice, only a sharp, crystalline awareness that destiny often hinges upon a single, quiet crossroads where one must decide whether to step out into the terrifying, beautiful unknown. A soft cooing from the basket she carried, for she had brought little Obed with her in a linen sling, pulled her back to the present. She knelt down in the soft grass beneath the gnarled trunk of an olive tree, lifting the baby into her arms. His tiny fingers curled instinctively around her thumb, a grip surprisingly strong for one so small. "You are the harvest of a long winter, little one," she whispered against his soft, downy head, breathing in the sweet, milky scent of him. "And the earth beneath your feet is holy ground." As the afternoon waned, casting long purple shadows across the Judean wilderness, Boaz joined them beneath the trees. He came directly from the threshing floor, his tunic dusted with golden chaff and the clean, earthy smell of crushed grain clinging to his garments. His face, weathered by decades under the blazing Levantine sun, softened instantly when he saw his wife and son framed against the ancient roots of the olive tree. He knelt beside them, placing a calloused, gentle hand upon Ruth's shoulder. For a long moment, neither spoke. The vast, cathedral-like silence of the hills wrapped around them like a protective mantle. The sheep bells chimed softly in the valley below as a shepherd led his flock back toward the folds for the night, a timeless sound that had echoed across these very hills since the days of the patriarchs. The elders met by the gate at noon, Boaz said quietly, his voice deep and steady. Tobiah brought word from the northern pastures that the spring rains are expected early this year. The earth will be soft for the seed. "Everything is being made new," Ruth murmured, leaning into his touch, feeling the absolute stability of his presence. "Yes," Boaz agreed, looking out over the land that stretched toward the horizon, where the sky was beginning to burn with the brilliant crimson and gold of a desert sunset. "And we are only the keepers of the gate for those who will follow after us." The night descended swiftly upon Bethlehem, pulling a velvet curtain sewn with diamond stars across the vast expanse of the heavens. In the quiet darkness, the village slept deeply, cradled in the ancient hills, while the spirit of chaste, that unfailing, stubborn, redemptive love, hovered over the landscape like a silent blessing, guarding the dawn of a new and luminous age. The morning sun did not simply rise over the terraced hills of Bethlehem, it slowly dissolved the lavender shadows that pooled in the limestone valleys, painting the dew-kissed barley stubble in shades of pale amber and shimmering rose. Inside the stone-walled courtyard of Boaz's ancestral home, the air was cool and sweet with the scent of crushed olive leaves and wood smoke drifting from a neighbor's hearth. Naomi sat upon a woven mat in the shadowed portico, her hands resting quietly in the lap of her indigo tunic, no longer trembling with the sharp, hollow ache that had defined her years in the scorched fields of Moab. The bitterness that had once hardened her features, transforming her name in her own mind from pleasantness to the sharp sting of sorrow, had been quietly melted away by the persistent warmth of an unyielding devotion. In her arms, cradled in soft linen bands of undyed wool, lay a small, breathing warmth that seemed to anchor the entire household in a profound and abiding peace. She looked down at the infant's tiny face, noting the curve of a cheek that bore a striking resemblance to the quiet strength of Boaz and the gentle, luminous patience of Ruth. Obed, they had named him, the servant, the one who brings restoration, and as his small chest rose and fell in rhythmic slumber, Naomi felt the long broken threads of her lineage being carefully knotted back into the tapestry of Israel. She remembered the dusty road from Moab, the heavy silence that had hung between her and her daughters-in-law as they crossed the border into a land of uncertainty, and she marveled at the invisible architecture of providence that had guided their faltering steps toward this exact, sunlit threshold. Across the courtyard, where the kitchen stones were built into the sturdy retaining wall, Ruth was already moving with her customary quiet grace, grinding roasted grain on a saddle quern of vesicular basalt. The rhythmic scrape of the upper stone against the lower produced a low, soothing hum that blended with the morning calls of turtle doves nesting in the eaves of the stone storehouses. Her dark hair was loosely gathered back with a cord of twisted flax, and stray strands caught the golden morning light as she bent rhythmically to her work, her mind drifting back across the years to the windswept hills of her childhood. There was a time when the world beyond Moab had seemed a forbidding labyrinth of strange gods and unfamiliar customs, a place where she would forever remain an outsider, a stranger standing on the periphery of a covenant she did not yet understand. Yet as she worked the heavy stone, feeling the satisfying resistance of the hard wheat kernels beneath her palms, she realized that belonging was not a matter of birthplace or bloodline, but of the deep, daily choices to love without reservation. Chaste, that stubborn, merciful, covenant-keeping love had not remained an abstract theological concept whispered by the temple priests in Shiloh. It had worn the dusty sandals of Boaz, it had spoken with the weary yet hopeful voice of Naomi, and it had found a home within her own resilient heart. When the basket was filled with soft, pale flour, Ruth brushed the dust from her hands and walked out toward the terraced orchards where the olive trees twisted their ancient, silver-green boughs toward the morning sky. The path wound downward between dry stone walls draped with wild caper plants and trailing vines of hyssop, the earth beneath her bare feet cool and firm with the lingering moisture of the night. Every stone along this path, every weathered outcrop of limestone and every gnarled trunk of an olive tree spoke of generations who had plowed, planted, harvested, and wept in these very valleys long before the judges ruled in Israel. Boaz was standing near the lower stone wall, inspecting the sturdy branches of a pomegranate tree that was heavy with ripening fruit, his broad shoulders framed against the vast, pale blue expanse of the morning sky. Hearing the soft whisper of footsteps on the packed earth, he turned, his sun-weathered face breaking into a wide, familiar smile that crinkled the corners of his dark eyes. He set down the small pruning knife he had been holding and walked to meet her, his stride steady and unhurried, embodying the very rhythm of the land he tended. "The wind has shifted from the south," Boaz said softly, reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from Ruth's forehead with a hand that was calloused from labor yet remarkably gentle. "The air smells of the desert, but the wells are full, and the sheep grazed peacefully until dawn." "The child is sleeping," Ruth replied, leaning into the warmth of his palm, finding in his steady presence a sanctuary from all the storms of the past. Naomi holds him as though she were afraid he might vanish like a morning mist, yet her face is full of a quiet joy I have never seen upon it before. "He will not vanish," Boaz murmured, wrapping his arms gently around her shoulders and drawing her close against his chest, where the steady, powerful thud of his heart matched the slow, enduring pulse of the hills. "He is the root of a tree that will spread its branches far beyond these valleys." The elders at the city gate spoke truly when they said our house would be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, for the foundations we lay today are built upon loyalty that transcends the grave. They stood together for a long moment beneath the sprawling canopy of an ancient terebinth tree, watching the sunlight filter through the trembling leaves to dapple the dry earth with shifting patterns of gold and shadow. Far down the valley, a shepherd was leading his flock toward a watering trough, the metallic chime of bronze bells drifting upward on the gentle thermal currents like a lullaby sung by the earth itself. There was no need for grand declarations or hurried plans, for the day unfolded with the quiet certainty of the seasons, each moment pregnant with a deep, unshakable grace. As the morning advanced toward noon, the heat began to rise in shimmering waves above the distant hills of Moab, turning the far horizon into a hazy, dreamlike wash of violet and pale gold. They walked back toward the shaded courtyard where Naomi waited, the baby now stirring softly in her arms with a tiny, contented sigh. The house smelled of baking bread and sweet olive oil, a haven of refuge carved out of the rugged Judean wilderness, where the grief of yesterday had been transmuted into the golden harvest of tomorrow. The afternoon stretched out in a long, sun-drenched pause, the village of Bethlehem settling into a restorative hush as the inhabitants sought shelter from the peak of the midday heat within the cool, thick-walled interiors of their stone homes. Outside, the cicadas kept up a steady, hypnotic chorus that seemed to measure out the slow, peaceful seconds of the afternoon, vibrating through the dry grasses and the sun-baked soil. Ruth sat beside Naomi on the low stone bench by the courtyard cistern, helping to wound fine linen thread onto wooden spools, their fingers occasionally brushing against one another in quiet harmony. "When I was a girl in Moab," Ruth whispered, her voice barely louder than the rustle of the olive leaves overhead, "I used to watch the caravans winding their way across the desert toward Egypt, and I wondered what stories the travelers carried in their hearts. I never imagined that my own story would lead me through such darkness only to find such an overwhelming light at the end of the road." "The journey is never finished while we draw breath," Naomi answered, her voice rich with the hard-earned wisdom of a woman who had seen her world crumble and miraculously rebuild itself from the dust. "We are simply chapters in a much larger scroll that is being written by hands we cannot see. Every sorrow we endured, every lonely night in the foreign fields, and every handful of barley gleaned in the heat of the day, none of it was wasted. It was all preparing us to receive the fullness of a blessing we were too blind to anticipate. The shadows began to lengthen across the dusty courtyard, stretching long and cool toward the eastern wall as the sun commenced its slow, majestic descent toward the Mediterranean coast far to the west. Boaz returned from the fields, his tunic dusted with chaff and the rich smell of the earth, carrying a basket of ripe figs that were bursting with sweet, purple juice. They sat together around a low wooden table under the open sky, sharing simple food, hard bread, sharp goat cheese, sweet fruit, and cool spring water drawn deep from the limestone aquifer beneath the village. As the dusk settled over the hills, painting the sky in deep indigo and bruised violet, the first stars began to pierce the velvet dome of the heavens with sharp, brilliant points of silver. The village grew wonderfully still, the sounds of daily labor fading into the deep, breathing quiet of the Judean night. Wrapped in a wool cloak, Ruth leaned her head against Boaz's shoulder, watching the constellations wheel slowly across the vast, indifferent beauty of the cosmos, knowing that within this tiny corner of the earth, they were fiercely, tenderly held by a love that would outlast the mountains themselves. And there we leave it, a story told, a night well spent. Thank you for trusting easy drift sleep with your rest. If these stories bring you comfort, subscribing means we can keep making them for you. Good night. Sleep well.